Page 5 of today's calendar, Senate Bill 369, printer's number 382 is before us. The question is, will the House agree to this bill? On that question, the representative from Delaware County, Representative Friend, indicates there is an additional amendment to be offered at this time. The clerk will read the Friend amendment.
It's Amendment A 3400. Amend Section 5, page 11, lines 38 through 42.
On this amendment, the chair recognizes Representative Friend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I indicated at the outset of this debate, one of the provisions presently in the legislation provides concurrent jurisdiction to the Attorney General for enforcement of the Abortion Control Act. And this was done because the Attorney General desired to have that jurisdiction in view of the fact that a lot of the sections are complicated, have reporting requirements to state agencies. However, the Attorney General has recently met, I think it was today, with the District Attorneys Association. And there's a fear there, not on the issue itself, but this would begin an encroachment process on the original jurisdiction of local law enforcement. The Attorney General wants to allay the fear of local law enforcement, does not want to be involved in a turf war with local law enforcement, nor do we. Therefore, responding to the concern of the Attorney General as expressed to us, and also the concern of local law enforcement, this amendment deletes the section which would give concurrent jurisdiction to the Attorney General. I think this is an amendment that we can all support, and I ask for passage. Thank you.
Question is whether the House will adopt Amendment 3400. On that question, yeas and nays will now be taken. Members will proceed to vote. Have all the members present voted? Have all members voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the amendment, the yeas are 199, the nays 0. The amendment has been adopted. The question is, will the House agree to the bill as now amended? And on that question, the representative from Allegheny County, Representative Farmer, indicates that there is another amendment to be offered. The clerk will read the Farmer amendment.
It's Amendment A 3338. Amend Section 4, Section 3211, page 8.
Question is whether the House will agree to Amendment A 3338. And on that question, Chair recognizes the author of the amendment, Representative Farmer from Allegheny County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hope that you will all find this a very simple amendment. In essence, what we are doing is changing the penalties for the viability after 24 weeks back to coincide with our current Abortion Control Act and to bring them into conformity with the same penalties that we have for the Infanticide Act. And I would request your support of this amendment.
Question is on the amendment from Delaware County, Representative Friend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support this amendment. We weighed this issue for the last couple of weeks back and forth about standard of care. And the point of the matter is, this does make it more consistent with the other provisions, the third degree felony rather than the first degree. I think it's a good amendment. I hope we can all support it. Thank you.
On the amendment, the yeas and nays will now be taken. Members will proceed to vote. Have all members present voted?
They are.
Have all members voted? The clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the amendment, the yeas are 201, the nays 0. The amendment has been adopted. The question is, will the House agree to the bill? On that question from Center County, Representative Rudy indicates there is an additional amendment. The clerk will read the Rudy amendment.
It's Amendment A 3353. Amend Section 2, Section 3208.
The question is, will the House adopt will the House adopt Amendment 3353? And on that question, the author of the amendment, Representative Rudy from Center County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my amendment is very clear and straightforward. This amendment requires that the pictures of fetuses that doctors must offer to their patients be accurate and relevant. I'm sure we all agree that women have the right to accurate and complete information on which to base their decision whether or not to have an abortion. If we are going to require doctors to offer pictures of fetuses to their patients, we have a responsibility to be sure that these pictures are accurate and pertain to the stage of pregnancy that the woman is in, so she can understand what she is doing. I urge a yes vote on this amendment.
On the amendment from Delaware County, Representative Friend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issue here are the printed materials which a woman ought to have access to. And one of the things is to be advised of the gestational characteristics of the unborn baby. Now, we don't regulate how the department publishes these materials, only that they be done in a responsible fashion. There's two problems with this amendment. First, even a well-formed baby at an early stage is extremely tiny. If in fact you have a picture in there with the actual scale, it'll be virtually impossible to see. Number two, at a later stage, like 24 weeks, or later than that, you're not going to have a pamphlet big enough to contain the actual scale of the size of that unborn baby. So I think what we ought to do here is do exactly what we did in the legislation, trust the judgment of the Department of Welfare with respect to the preparation of these materials. We want it to be balanced. We want them to be realistic. I think the existing language is adequate. I think this would make good information to assist the woman virtually impossible on both ends of the spectrum with respect to the unborn child. I hope we defeat the amendment. Thank you.
Question is on the amendment. On that question, from Philadelphia, Representative Josephs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say that I am amazed that this amendment is being opposed, because I thought that we all agreed that women were allowed, should have, had an obligation to have accurate information before they made this decision. For those of you in the anti-abortion movement, I'm sorry that a very early embryo or fetus is really tiny, but it happens to be a scientific fact. And if we deny our constituents the truth of this kind of scientific fact, I think we are being very, very intellectually dishonest and very disrespectful of their right to know. I like to quote something said by the gentleman from Delaware County in the Wall Street Journal, October 19th, where he said, regardless of whether one supports or opposes the right to an abortion, it is virtually impossible for any rational human being to disagree with the concept that a woman has the right to have all of the appropriate material and advice made available to her before she makes a decision which one way or another might remain with her for the rest of her life. I agree. I agree. I think everybody here ought to agree with me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question is on the amendment, and on that question, Representative Friend for the second time.
Mr. Speaker, I've looked at this language again, and it says must contain the dimensions. That doesn't mean that each picture has to be the actual size. I read that long. I've got no problem with realistic and appropriate. When I look at this a second time, this is a good amendment. I hope we can support it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Question is on the amendment, and on that question.
Mr. Speaker.
The
Mr. Speaker.
I just wanted to say I'm glad that Representative Friend read the amendment thoroughly.
Mr. Speaker.
Representative Josephs from Philadelphia. Do you understand that, Representative Josephs?
I guess so. I wanted to establish for legislative history that we mean that the picture be drawn to scale. If the embryo is a millimeter, the picture is a millimeter.
The yeas and nays will now be taken on the amendment. Members will proceed to vote. Have all members voted? Have all the members voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the amendment, the yeas are 198, the nays 1. The amendment is carried. Will the House agree to the bill? From Montgomery County, Representative Gladdick indicates there is an additional amendment. Clerk will read the Gladdick amendment.
It's Amendment A3478, amend title, page 1, line 7.
This House will be in order. Members will cease conversations, take their seats. We've done well most of the day. Let's not break down at this time of day. On the amendment, Representative Gladdick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I stand before you this evening and I offer this amendment in all humbleness. It's a binding referendum to be placed on the ballot 60 days after the effective date of this act upon the signing of this legislation by the governor, if that should occur. The question, shall the 1989 Abortion Control Act take effect, would be the question that would be asked. I don't purport to be omnipotent on the abortion question. Accordingly, I believe that this is an issue so divisive and that the opinions of Pennsylvanians are so diverse that I believe that the people of Pennsylvania should be the final arbiter as to whether or not this act shall become the law. I ask for your serious consideration of this amendment and your vote. Thank you.
From Philadelphia, Representative Kozinski on the amendment.
Will the speaker stand for interrogation?
I'd be more than happy to try to answer your questions.
Mr.
Gentleman
Speaker,
indicates he will.
how will the referendum question be phrased?
Mr. Speaker, I just said that in my initial remarks. It shall say, shall the 1989 Abortion Control Act take effect? And it will be placed on the ballot 60 days at the next election, no less than 60 days after the effective passage of this act. And the act shall not take effect until such time as the people of Pennsylvania get a chance to vote on it.
Mr. Speaker, on the Gladdick amendment.
Gentleman is in order.
Mr. Speaker, as a four-term state representative and as somebody who's handled the tough issues with each and every one of us in here, I would oppose the Gladdick amendment. There are a number of us sent up here to handle these issues and to vote on them. We have dealt with referendum questions before, and even in Mr. Gladdick's phrasing of a very difficult referendum question, there is an inadequacy that most people will not understand. First of all, you see 203 members in front of you today who in good faith are debating this Abortion Control Act, yet even most of the members here would not be able to tell you what is involved in that act. So you have a problem there with the informational flow going out to the voter. The second one, again, as I mentioned before, is a philosophical problem. We are put here by our constituents to handle the tough questions and to take a stand. Third, I'm always worried about the inequality in financial facilities and financial wherewithal from the abortion side. They have abortion clinics, they have a constituency out there that makes their living from abortion and would be able to fully fund such a referendum question. The pro-life side does not have that financial incentive. For all those reasons, I would ask vote against the Gladdick referendum amendment.
Question is on the amendment. On that question, the Minority Leader, Representative Ryan from Delaware County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the gentleman, Mr. Kaczynski, gave my speech a moment ago. While I was waiting my turn, I listened to my speech being given. I've been up here for a long while, and I've opposed time after time the idea of placing any of the tough questions on a referendum. I think we're paid to be up here. It's a representative form of government. We're paid to represent our people, bite the bullet, and make the tough votes. If we start to give in on the tough votes and place it on a referendum, it'll be very easy to do that with the increase of taxes, put that on a referendum, increase legislative pay scales, put that on a referendum, and welfare benefits on a referendum, and on and on and on. Anything that we don't want to face head on, we'll say we'll put it on a referendum. I don't think that's why we're here. I think that to do it is doing a disservice to our constituents, and that has nothing to do whatsoever with the bill that's before us, be you pro-choice or pro-life. We're not paid to pass it on to the voters. We're paid to bite the bullet and vote it ourselves.
From Allegheny County, Representative Markosik.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I also oppose this amendment. I also oppose referendums in general. I think all we have to do is look back to last spring, where we saw a referendum on the ballot with tax reform. Regardless of how you felt about tax reform, the one thing that I heard loud and clear in my district is people didn't understand it. Probably had a lot to do with it being defeated. They just simply didn't know, they didn't understand it. That was probably a lot less complicated an issue than this abortion bill. As complicated as that was, this is even more so. We are in a representative form of government here in Pennsylvania. We're elected to come up here and vote. I think we're also the people that our constituents put their trust in us to study these issues, to learn as much as we can about these issues, because they simply don't have the time to do it. They put their judgment in us. They elect us to come in here to make the judgments for them. For that reason, I would oppose this and any other amendment that would propose referendums in Pennsylvania. Thank you.
From Bucks County, Representative Clymer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I also stand in opposition to the Gladdick amendment. If we want an issue that's going to divide our communities, be divisive within the schools and churches, then this is the issue. Mr. Speaker, as has been mentioned before, we have been paid a workable salary to come up and make these tough decisions. Obviously, this is one of them. We should be making the decision, and again, I ask for a no vote. Thank you.
On the amendment from Allegheny County, Representative Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like some of my colleagues have spoken earlier, I would agree that, in general, most referendum questions are bad. But then I started hearing certain statements saying that the general public doesn't have the ability to be able to understand. Again, here we come, and when I got elected, and yes, sir, I can read and I can hear you quite well. And again, here we come to a particular issue where two sides, and I don't know if they really come to us and asked us to play Solomon. But here, someone is giving a chance, and I read all over the newspapers from all over the country, whether it's the Miami Herald, whether it's the Chronicle out in San Francisco, and all these other different issues, that say that Pennsylvania legislatures are the most pro-life legislatures, but all of the polls, whether it's the New York Times, whether it's the Jacksonville, which is one of, in Florida, what's one of the best newspapers in the country, have said that the general public is about equal. Now, obviously, there is someone, and somehow here, there's a discrepancy. Now, I was elected to come up here to prepare a budget for the people that are back home. Not to sit down and discuss primarily a moral issue of which someone has a driving force, and all we're doing is not dealing with black and white, but we want to deal with a lot of gray area. Because I would think that if he was really serious to either make it yes or no, he would say that this is a matter of life or death. And if you're that serious about abortion, you would simply say that if you have an abortion, you have created a first-degree murder. But he doesn't, in my opinion, have the guts to submit that form of amendment. I want to take my other 2 minutes, Mr. Speaker. This is the type of an issue when I'm talking about of elitism, when again I say every poll shows that our voters back at home in general, all over the general population of the state, are equal. But yet, in a sense, all the polls say that Pennsylvania has the most pro-life legislature in the country. Now, something is amiss here. And here we have a chance to let the majority of the people to be able to decide an issue, and it's not passing the buck. A lot of the people in the royal districts, you don't understand what you're going to have to pay for when things happen because of the difference in the teenage pregnancies and different things that are happening. But when we can give a chance for both sides to compete on a fair and competitive issue, I think that that is our moral obligation. Not to be so cocky where we feel that the people, and I quote, don't have the ability to be able to make a qualitative and a quantitative decision. That's an insult to my people back in my district. Because yes, sir, they can read. They have a right to be able to decide what they want to do and to be able to put a referendum on the ballot whether or not they want to support it up or whether or not you want to support it down. I would ask for an affirmative vote on the Gladdick amendment.
From Berks County, Representative Gallen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for some years I was chairman of the State Government Committee, and during those years there was legislation introduced which would provide for initiative and referendum on various issues. Those bills were never considered by that committee because I didn't allow them to be considered. It's my idea that this is representative government. We were elected to come here and represent the people. And Mr. Speaker, on this issue, I feel that we should vote and decide whether we are going to allow babies to be killed and mutilated in the womb. I think that's our job, and let's not cop out.
From Washington County, Representative Daley on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened to great oration about what the framers of our Constitution have talked about in terms of redress of grievance and referendum. John Locke and Guy de Maupassant, when they were offering the first impulses of a representative democracy throughout the world, and the framers of the Federalist Papers said that there must be certain safeguards provided in a system of representative democracy that gives people a redress of grievance and a referendum in which the people can have their say in that representative democracy, that representative government. A referendum is simply a safeguard. It's the opportunity for people to offer that safeguard to voice their opinion. However, I think that we hear that on one side that we're saying that we are pushing the issue out to the public because we feel that maybe they lack the intelligence. And I don't think some of us that support the defeat of this amendment are saying that people are not intelligent. I think conversely, there are people saying, if we don't vote on this, maybe we're not intelligent. What I'm simply saying is that the framers of our Constitution said that there are certain safeguards that must be exercised and in place. However, on every issue that we have to face, we cannot push that issue out to the people. That is not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to face the issue as we have in the past and make a stand. We are accountable. Are we going to shift that accountability to the public? No, we're not. What I'm simply saying is I think there might be another political agenda here. Bear in mind the question that I proposed to you, and I ask for defeat of this amendment.
From Center County, the chair recognizes Representative Rudy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to urge my colleagues to support the Gladdick amendment, and I don't feel like I'm passing the buck on this issue. as this is an amendment which pro-choice and anti-abortion members can and should support. Because no matter how you feel about abortion, each and every one of us has constituents with feelings and beliefs on what role government should play in this decision. Isn't it time that we heard from the people that we're supposed to represent? If this amendment passes, we won't have to guess anymore. We will know once and for all the true representatives passes tonight, we're going to have to live with for a long, long time. So let's give our people a voice. Vote for this amendment. Thank you.
From Philadelphia, Representative Joseph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think some House members might be surprised at what I'm about to say because I oppose this amendment with all due respect to its maker. I don't think we allow people, encourage people, want people to vote on constitutional rights. We have a constitutional right to our privacy. If we vote on that, what do we vote on next? Our right to free speech, perhaps. It's not because we won't win. I know we'd win because we're in the majority and we're right. But the amendment, the referendum, would be non-binding. I draw your attention, ladies and gentlemen, to the fact that in State Government Committee I have now a constitutional amendment to the Pennsylvania Constitution which requires a referendum. That referendum is binding. That's the referendum we ought to be voting on. The wording of my constitutional amendment is the right of the people to reproductive privacy shall not be violated. And I challenge the members of this House to put that amendment, that constitutional amendment out twice and send it to the people for a binding referendum because that's how we're going to settle this issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question is on the amendment, and on that question, from York County, Representative Bortner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me first respond to the suggestion that enactment of this referendum would be somehow divisive. I've got news for you. The people are already divided on this issue, and I think we all know that. Is it 60-40? Is it 65-35? I don't know. I think we all believe we have some idea of where our constituency is on this issue, but I don't believe anybody knows with certainty. I agree basically with what Mr. Ryan said, and I have that position on most issues. I think that this issue is different. We require that constitutional amendments go by referendum to the people. Many people think that this act will impact on or limit constitutional rights. Whether you agree that this interferes with constitutional rights or not, I think you can certainly agree that it certainly impacts on fundamental, basic rights. And it is much different than any legislation that we consider here because of the nature of which its very personal impact affects every one of our constituents. I think there are very few issues that we take up that touch our constituents in the way that this issue will. Let me address a couple of the questions that were raised about this specifically. Number one is the question about whether information will get out to our constituents. Is there anybody in here who believes that people will not get information from both of the advocates on this issue as to what this issue is all about? I also take my hat off to Mr. Gladdick, who I think has very artfully and very carefully drafted a very simple statement. You don't have to read anything into it. It doesn't require you to interpret any language. It is very simple. Shall the 1989 Abortion Control Act take effect? Period. That's it. That's all. May I continue, please, for 2 more minutes, Mr. Speaker? I think that language is very clearly understood will be very easy to understand. I think the people that we represent understand what this issue is all about. I think many of them feel frustrated because they don't believe that their views are being represented. And I say that on either side. I have to ask myself, what are the people that oppose this referendum afraid of? Why are people afraid to take this basic fundamental question to the people of Pennsylvania and let them make a decision? I honestly don't consider this a pro-choice or a pro-life amendment. I think this is very simply an amendment which will help us to resolve what I think is a very, very difficult question for most of us as legislators. I would urge you to support the Gladdick amendment and support the referendum that will, for once and for all, let the people of Pennsylvania decide this issue. Thank you.
Question is on the amendment. On that question from York County, Representative Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to oppose the Gladdick amendment. And as I look around the nation and see states that have similar referenda process, that tells me exactly why we should oppose it. If you will look at states that put questions like this upon the ballot, many times contradictory questions can be placed on the ballot, and lo and behold, contradictory ballot questions will pass. I ask you once again to consider the situation in the state of Ohio, where school budgets, for example, are a matter of public referendum, and it becomes government by crisis after the school budget fails for about the third straight time. Enough parents get together and say enough, we'll do the necessary. In short, we have representative government. We're asked to come here and make decisions. We're well paid for being asked to make those decisions. So for heaven's sake, let's be willing to stand here and make those decisions. I firmly suggest that we reject the Gladdick amendment.
From Allegheny County, Representative Olaz.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the Gladdick amendment and some other comments made by our legislators. If we would play on a level playing field and have an opportunity to express our arguments, I'd say yes. But here is an outstanding example of the biased, prejudice reporting done by Pittsburgh newspapers. From the time the decision was rendered by the Supreme Court in July, our people have been inundated throughout the Commonwealth with propaganda about abortion. For example, right across the front page of Saturday morning's Post-Gazette, there are 4 columns there, and on page 2, another full page. You know how many lines a pro-life member got? 3 lines and 1 word. Is that playing on a fair field? As sure as certainly as those abortion mills are grinding up the unborn, you'll see the special interests pour money into this, and no one will get an unbiased opinion. And I defy anyone to tell me the editorials have promoted a fair side of the question. The fact of the matter is, the newspapers no longer inform the public. They are trying to form public opinion. Think about it. Think about it.
From Philadelphia County, Representative Roebuck on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard tonight that we have been sent here to Harrisburg to handle the tough issues, and that somehow there is a problem if we put a referendum on a ballot because some people have more resources than other people. And then we also understand somehow some people don't understand what the referendum question is about, and that also means you shouldn't do that. And we talk a lot about representative government, but beyond a representative government, I believe we live in what is called a democracy. And in a democracy, all authority is derived from the people. From nowhere else, it's from the people. And the people ought to have the right to make themselves heard very clearly on this issue. Now, a referendum is nothing that's radical. It's nothing that's new. It's something that's inherent to government. It's been there for a long time. It says simply that people have the right to express themselves on a public issue and make themselves heard in a way that everyone knows how every voter feels. It's very simple. And I can tell you, if it doesn't happen in a referendum, it might very well happen in an election. So it's very clear to us. We have a choice here. And the choice is to move forward and hear what the people have to say on this issue, respect their opinion. It doesn't mean that you're bound by that opinion. You have a referendum, you can still come back and choose to do this again. But it gives to every citizen in this state a simple right of saying, on this issue, this is where I stand. I want to be heard. I think all of us, as elected representatives, ought to respect that right of each voter in this Commonwealth.
From Philadelphia County, Representative Richardson on the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let me first say that I rise in a very strange situation this evening, because this is probably one of the first times that I am supporting my colleague on any such amendment, Representative Gladdick. I want to make that clear.
It's great to have you.
This is a strange phenomenon in the House of Representatives here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but it shows that it's democracy at work. And let me say that if there ever was a question raised on the floor of this House concerning choice, that this is an opportunity for every individual who's here in the floor of this House to say, for once, that they allow their constituencies to vote in favor of their conscience. Now, Representative Friend and those who are the proponents on the other side of this issue should not be feared at all by this referendum question, since they're so clear in their mind that there's no other question more prevalent than this issue facing the House of Representatives than we've seen in past years, that I don't know why there's a reluctance or there is a reluctance to support the referendum question, which raises this question to me. Power concedes power only to power. And power concedes nothing without a demand it never has and it never will. Frederick Douglass, 1856. What are you afraid of, Representative Friend? If you're sincere about the fact that there are so many people in this Commonwealth who support your position, then put the question before the people. If in fact people elect us to government and they are here because we are elected by people, then why do we not put the same question for them on the question on abortion? Is it because you know that you'll lose, or is it because you'll use this as an opportunity just to get over in the wake of the fact that this House of Representatives seems to be more conservative on this question than the constituents who truly should be represented by people who have a pro-choice thinking? I'd like to extend my 2 minutes, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. Then in that light, I would suggest that perhaps maybe all of those who see themselves in a different light say now to their constituents back home, we'll put it to the referendum question. You have an opportunity to show where your real heart really is. It is not one of speculation. It is one of time of truth. That truth crushed the earth shall rise again. There's nothing mystical about that, but if you're sincere about your convictions, or is it just that we want to play games with the public here because you happen to be on national TV? Or is it because we recognize the fact that out of all of the states in the east wing of this country, that it seems to me that Pennsylvania winds up to be the most backwards as a result of dealing with the question of pro-choice? Even in Washington, the question of the referendum, in terms of where things are, have changed the number of congresspersons who wanted to be on your side. But all of a sudden, they've seen now the light, and now they want to be reelected to office, so they've changed their position. I suggest tonight, brothers and sisters and ladies and gentlemen, that you change your vote and vote in favor of the referendum question.
Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes the Minority Leader. The Speaker has been very patient and tolerant with members of the House and with members of the gallery. Demonstrations are not permitted either on the floor of the House or in the gallery. I would ask that members who are guests of the House please refrain from demonstrations on either side of the question. From York County, Representative Snyder on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think the initiative and referendum process has a place. I think it's appropriate when we're talking about the kinds of taxes that should be levied and at what rate, and particularly at the local level. I think it's appropriate on those kinds of issues. However, I don't believe that this is the kind of issue we're dealing with here this evening. We are dealing basically with an issue that the ultimate questions are, what is the nature of life? What is humanity? When does life begin? And how should that life be protected, if at all? I don't think those questions should be put to a popularity contest. I don't think those questions should be argued in an arena that smacks of a political campaign. I think those are fundamental questions that must be answered by our conscience and the duty that we have to serve in public office. I oppose this amendment. I ask the members to vote against it. I also ask the members to consider that the unborn children will not have a vote on that referendum question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
From Lancaster County, Representative Barley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise to oppose this amendment also. It's been well stated many times earlier this evening on this issue that we, as elected representatives, are sent here to represent and reflect the wishes of our constituents, and we have the responsibility to do that. As it relates to the issue of referendum, I think there is a referendum on this issue, and there will be a referendum on this issue as it relates to the way we cast our votes here this evening. And that'll be next year, 1990, when we're all up for re-election. The voters will have an opportunity to voice their opinions and to cast their votes, and it'll be a referendum on the way we're casting our votes here, and for the way that our constituents are satisfied with the representation that we're giving them. I think in a representative form of government, as we're governed by, that's truly the way it should function. So I think we should be responsible and vote no on this issue before us and go on with the rest of the debate this evening.
From Westmoreland County, Representative Kukovic on the amendment.
Don't worry, don't worry. I just have one question of interrogation for the maker of the amendment, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there might be some confusion on the floor of the House about the practical impact of this. For the purpose of legislative intent, could you explain to the House members if this is actually binding, not just in the way it is written, but whether it needs to be a constitutional amendment to be binding, or is it, in your opinion, based on your research, it's binding as written?
It's binding as written. I don't believe it needs a constitutional amendment. If you would turn your attention to the amendment, the binding part of the referendum, it says, with the exception of the amendments to Section 4302 related to incest, the provisions of this Act shall not apply to any person until a question thereon is submitted to the electors of this Commonwealth at the next municipal or general election, occurring at least 60 days after the effective date of this Act, and a majority voting thereon vote in the affirmative. This question shall be in the following form, etc. I think that would answer your question, Representative Kukovic, as to whether or not it's binding. Thank you.
On the amendment, From Blair County, Representative Geist.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to oppose this amendment, and I do so for other reasons other than some of the other members. For instance, when Representative O'Donnell wanted the Philadelphia Convention Center so badly, if that would have appeared on a referendum statewide, do you think the people in Dick Olaz's district would have voted for that? When Representative O'Donnell and the other Philadelphia members in the suburbs were lobbying to get SEPTA monies and save SEPTA, if that was put on a statewide referendum, do you think it would have passed in western Pennsylvania or all over the state?
Will the gentleman suspend?
Mr. Speaker.
Demonstrations by members of the House are equally out of order.
And Mr. Speaker, one last rhetorical question. If workfare were placed on a referendum, how do you think that would have fared statewide? Would it have been voted down? I think not. I think we should get about the business that we're here to do, vote no on this amendment, and let's get on with the night.
From Philadelphia County, Representative Weston, on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I agree with the arguments of representative democracy, I oppose the referendum amendment for further reasons. The Pennsylvania state constitution basically provides for only two types of referendum questions, and that is on constitutional amendments and on questions of debt. We would be diverting from the history that our Constitution is based in if we were to allow a question of this type to go on our ballot. There has never been a question of this type on a statewide referendum in Pennsylvania, and I would urge every member to vote no on this amendment.
On the amendment, Representative O'Donnell, the majority leader, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the gentleman, Mr. Geist, is right. None of the items he mentioned would ever succeed in a statewide referendum, and of course neither would economic development for Blair County, high-speed rail, or Conrail. So let's settle that. This debate appears to be about tough decisions. We have been making decisions here that are tough for a long time, in my case for 14 years, including on the abortion issue. A vote for this amendment does not in any way take the burden off any of us. We have already been recorded here tonight on the subject of abortion and on specifically this proposed Abortion Act. So the notion that we're trying to shift the responsibility, I don't think is a valid one. How tough is this decision really? I think for many people, including Representative Friend, who very candidly put forward his personal philosophy, I don't think it's a very tough decision at all. The facts here are not really at issue. Human life starts as a single cell and matures into a full human being. The biological facts are not at issue. What's at issue is at what point does the spiritual quality enter that entity in such a way that it is truly human and has all the moral and legal characteristics of a human being. If you believe that that moment is at the moment of conception, I don't think this is a tough decision for you tonight at all, because I think your conscience is absolutely clear with the kind of clarity that only faith can give you. If, on the other hand, you believe that human life only begins at the moment of birth, then I don't think this is a tough decision tonight for you either, because you too have that kind of clarity. The tough decision for us as legislators, it seems to me, is for those folks, and I number myself in this group, who are not of the view that human life begins at conception. I personally, and without, I'm sure there are citations available to profound text to support this, but that's not my basis. My basis is it just doesn't make sense to me that a single cell, despite its genetic code, equals a human being. And on the other hand, from personal experience, which I think is widely shared in this chamber, it is clear to me that human life begins sometime before birth. Those of you who, as a spouse or as a mother, have felt those stirrings inside, I think can be pretty certain that human life begins before birth. Good. Where does that leave us? It leaves people like me in a very difficult position, because I don't have the clarity that attaches to either of those other points of view. In my view, it happens sometime in the middle, and I, frankly, am not prepared to say exactly when. It makes it a tough decision, but it also says, how do you handle an issue when you are genuinely in doubt? In this country, the way we handle that kind of an issue is to give maximum freedom to those people who have to make that decision and whose lives are going to be most deeply affected by it. We have complained here on the floor tonight about how unfair life is. I heard that theme. We've talked about how tough the decisions are that we make. And indeed, for some of us, this abortion vote is a very tough decision. But how insignificant is the toughness of that decision compared to the decision of a woman and her family when faced with an unwanted pregnancy? I don't think that we should congratulate ourselves too fully on our ability to make tough decisions unless we are prepared to support people who are making truly tough decisions, decisions about their lives and the lives of their potential children. It is in their interest that this uncertainty must be conveyed back to them. It is in their interest, the interest of their privacy, and out of respect for the toughness of this decision as it faces individuals privately, that we hand that decision, in effect, back to them, after having expressed ourselves fully, as we have tonight. But they're the ones that have to make the tough decision. In my opinion, their lives are the ones most directly affected, and I think we should vote for this amendment and hand that decision back where it belongs.
From Allegheny County, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
If the Speaker must admonish the guests again, the gallery can be cleared. Representative Gigliotti from Allegheny County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to oppose the amendment, and I would like to explain to the members why. This is my first term as a legislator, and I was elected to this job to vote for my constituents back home. When I come up here 10 months, 11 months ago, I talked to a lot of my colleagues, and they say, Frank, you're going to be faced with some tough, very tough issues. We went through the budget, we went through the insurance, we went through a lot of other things here, and they were all tough. But this one has got to be the toughest one that everybody in this room is going to vote on today. And I rise against this amendment, and I'm asking all my colleagues to go with me. Thank you.
From Philadelphia County, Representative Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of the Gladdick Amendment. I think that our leader, the majority leader, provided us with a clear indication of why we need to support the Gladdick Amendment. However, I'd like to add an additional note to why the Gladdick Amendment should be supported. Number one, we have entertained this evening from 1 o'clock this afternoon up until now issues of first impression, issues that on either side of the aisle we are not absolutely clear about. Earlier, prior to recess, we entertained the whole notion of spousal notice and what constitutes spousal notice, and we entertained the question of whether this assembly should be in the business of determining whether or not and under what circumstances spousal notice should be provided. We are truly faced with issues that no matter how confident we feel about our representation, that we don't really have the answers to. We're also, even Mr. Friend raised questions tonight about his own amendment and whether or not he is traveling down the right route. And I submit that when reasonable men and women are confronted with questions of doubt, especially questions that are going to have not just an impact on our constituency today or tomorrow, but are going to have impact on our constituency for years to come. I think when confronted with questions like we have been confronted with this evening, it is time for us to let the voters speak once and for all in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It is time for us to be guided by the populace at large. It is our people back in our districts that hold the key to whether or not we should be,
Gentleman's time has elapsed.
May I have my additional 2 minutes, Mr. Speaker?
Gentleman's in order.
I think that we should let the voters make their final decision as to the circumstances under which this assembly should be interfering with a woman's right to choose, or how we should respond to this whole abortion issue. Be not afraid of a referendum. Referendums do not mean that you lose. If you're confident about how your constituents feel, then you have nothing to lose from a referendum. I think the referendum is the only route that can provide us with a clear indication of where people in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is at on this issue. And to that end, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, let's do the right thing and vote for the Gladdick Amendment overwhelmingly. Thank you.
From Philadelphia County, Representative Harper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support the Gladdick Amendment, and I know why the men, the majority in this House of Representatives, don't want this question to go on the ballot, because they know that they will lose. They want to continue to tell women what they can do with their bodies. And if they give women the opportunity to speak for themselves, this amendment will pass. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
From York County, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support Representative Gladdick's amendment. What's wrong with a referendum? Have any of you ever taken a survey on how your constituents feel about the abortion issue? I have. Came back pro-choice. Just this year, the senator from York County sent out a survey on the abortion question. He has already received 10,000 responses. That's why I want to call your attention to something that hasn't been mentioned yet, but is vitally important on Mr. Gladdick's amendment. There are a package of bills that has been offered to entice and interest more voters in the election process. We all see and are aware of the voter interest that's followed the abortion debate and the abortion question today. Can you imagine the voter interest, the voter registration that would follow having a referendum on this question? Not only that, it would be the people speaking. We make the tough decisions, but just like on tax reform, we're not always right. Let's let the people decide whether we're right or wrong, and support Representative Gladdick's amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
From Allegheny County, Representative Trello.
Mr. Speaker, earlier our majority leader talked about exactly how we felt about the position of when life began, at conception or at birth. Well, I don't think anybody really knows the true answer to that, but all I know, long before birth, you can hear a heartbeat. I know I've heard it myself with my own ear, and that's life. And long before birth, you can feel something move in my wife or the woman's stomach. And as far as I'm concerned, when something moves, there's life there. So I know how I feel, and that's why I believe that life begins at conception. And as far as this referendum is concerned, I too have sent out flyers and newsletters to get requests, and many of them came back in my district in favor of my position. That's why I'm speaking to it today. But with many of the other members that talk about us being here because we're sent to represent our district, well, that's the way I feel, and I feel strongly about it, and I urge everybody to vote no on this amendment. Thank you.
On the amendment from Delaware County, Representative Friend.
Very briefly, Mr. Speaker, I rise to oppose this amendment. The members who have stood here opposing this amendment have very eloquently stated that this issue goes far beyond abortion. This attacks the whole form of representative government. And in fact, if we duck the issue here, what precedent do we set down the road? If you're willing to duck one tough issue, then do we duck it on increases in welfare benefits? Do we duck it in taxes and a host of other issues? To the credit of this legislative body, time and again we've faced this, and time and again we've defeated it. I also agree with Representative Josephs, but for a different reason. Her point was on an issue of right and wrong, of in fact constitutional rights. You don't put that out for a referendum. You know, had a poll been taken in 1850 down south, the odds are that poll would have come back in favor of slavery. It wouldn't have made it right. Matter of fact, if George Gallup were around in 1775, he would have seen that about 2/3 of the colonists didn't want to break with England. And isn't it fortunate there wasn't a binding referendum, or we wouldn't have this nation? So for the issue of precedence, for ducking what should be the form of representative democracy, and also because of the fact that you don't place an issue like this of right and wrong on the ballot, I sincerely hope that we do what we've always done and defeat this type of an amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question is on the amendment, and on that question, yeas and nays will now be taken.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman, Mr. Gladdick.
I'll yield to Representative Wright.
You better take your own turn. I'm calling on people.
If you insist, Mr. Speaker, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll be short, and the hour is late. All of us on this floor purport to represent the people in Pennsylvania. I believe that to ignore the fact that we work for the citizens of this Commonwealth and that they do not work for us is wrong. I think that we should offer them the chance
Please be in order.
I think that we should offer the citizens in this state the chance to be the final check in a system of checks and balances. In a democracy, the people should be the final check. Any member who is afraid of their decision should not sit on this floor. I'm not afraid of their decision, and I thank you for your consideration, and I hope that you'll see fit to vote for the amendment. Thank you.
From Delaware County, Representative Wright on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support the Gladdick amendment. I have people in my district who are pro-choice. I have people in my district who are pro-life. I had a conversation with some pro-life people, and they tended to agree with me that the answer to this particular problem will never be resolved by the state legislature. Whatever is going to happen, whatever decision a woman wishes to make regarding an abortion is going to be her decision. I don't care what you say here. The choices may be whether it's going to be a legal abortion, whether it will be an illegal abortion, whether it will happen in a hospital or a clinic, or whether it will happen in the back room, whether it will happen in Pennsylvania or whether it will happen in another state that allows abortions. But the bottom line is that decision is personal, and it's still going to remain personal. I don't care what you pass here. For that reason, I think that the women of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, along with the men, ought to be given the right to make that decision and let us know how they feel about such a personal matter. Thank you.
Question is on the amendment, and on that question, yeas and nays will now be taken. Members will proceed to vote. Have all members present voted? Have all the members voted? The clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the amendment, the yeas are 64, the nays 137. The amendment has been defeated. For the information of the members who are keeping score, since we returned after the evening meal, we handled 4 amendments, and the chair has received 4 reconsideration motions. Will the House agree to the bill? On that question, the gentleman from Philadelphia, Representative Linton, indicates there is an additional amendment. Will the clerk read the Linton amendment?
It's Amendment A3471, men title, page 1, line 6.
Question is, will the House agree to the Linton Amendment 3471? On that question, Representative Linton is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
This one is not passed out.
Members are indicating that this amendment is not within the hands of members of the House. Is there information that can be given to the Speaker on that question? The Speaker is in receipt of an amendment. Has not been distributed.
Mr. Speaker, this amendment was drawn originally as 3362. There was a technical...
Will the gentleman suspend? Is the gentleman offering Amendment 3471?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, 34...
Then it must be in the hands of the members of the House. That's the rule of the House. We will go over this amendment temporarily and go to the next amendment until that has been distributed without objection. From Bucks County, Representative Heckler indicates there's an amendment to be offered. Will the clerk read the Heckler amendment?
It's Amendment A 3364, amend Section 10, page 12.
Question is, will the House agree to Amendment 3364? On that question, the author of the amendment from Bucks County, Representative Heckler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a very straightforward amendment. Some of the language in the Friend bill that we're dealing with requires that a woman, prior to seeking an abortion, receive certain information concerning the availability of public assistance and of child support from the alleged father of the child. My amendment would simply require that this bill become effective only when two things have happened. One, that the cash benefits available under the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program reach 100% of the federally established poverty level. And second, when child support enforcement collections in the Commonwealth exceed 80%. Right now, that number is about 50%. Only approximately 50% of those women who seek support for a child or children receive that support. And secondly, right now, we are, on the one hand, with this legislation, requiring women to have babies, making it more difficult, enticing them to choose to have babies. And what we propose, and in fact informing them that there are benefits out there for them, and what we propose to pay them at this juncture is, for a household of one, $1,980 to $2,460 a year, which is no more than 41% of the federal poverty level. If I may, Mr. Speaker, I will just conclude briefly and take my remaining time. I don't want to belabor this. If we, as we, with our votes repeatedly, have concluded that we have the wisdom to make these choices, to intrude ourselves into this decision-making process, and in fact determine what information is going to be provided to women in making this decision, I would urge that we not intervene in this way unless and until we are ready to follow up that promise with some help. It's a common joke that the so-called pro-life movement believes that life begins at conception and ends at birth. Let's not let that be the case in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Thank you.
The question is whether the Heckler Amendment will be adopted. On that question, Representative Friend from Delaware County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to strenuously oppose this amendment. You know, time and again, we do our best to assist the people of Pennsylvania, particularly those in need. We have to do it within budgetary constraints, and we have to do it in a way that doesn't destroy the taxpayers of Pennsylvania. But we do our best. What this amendment says is, until we reach a certain economic level with respect to AFDC or collection enforcement, until we reach that level, it's okay to have sex selection abortions. You can't have informed consent for women. You can't have spousal notice for husbands. You can't have any limitations on abortion after 24 weeks. It entirely guts the issue and guts the legislation. I don't buy the argument from the other side that pro-lifers only care about human beings until they're born. To be pro-life is to care for the sanctity of all human life from conception until natural death, and to do our very best to assist all of our people. It has never meant, however, that if one opposes the killing of unborn children, he or she of necessity must support a system of cradle-to-grave socialized welfare. Now, it would be nice if we could reach these goals, and I'm certain that we continue to work toward that goal. But to say that all of the value provisions of this legislation, which we've overwhelmingly adopted, are on hold until this happens is ludicrous. I sincerely hope that we overwhelmingly defeat the Heckler Amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question is whether the House will adopt the Heckler Amendment. On that question, yeas and nays will now be taken. Members will proceed to vote. Have all the members present voted? Have all the members present voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the amendment, the yeas are 48. The nays are 153. The amendment fails. Question is, will the House agree to the bill as it has been amended? On that question, there are additional amendments to be offered. Can the Speaker be advised by the Majority Leader as to the order of amendments from here on? From Philadelphia County, Representative Bishop indicates there is an amendment to be offered. Clerk will read the Bishop amendment.
It's Amendment A 3383. Amend Section 10, page 12, lines 10 through 15.
Question is, will the House agree to the Bishop amendment A 3383? On that question, Representative Bishop is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In this amendment that I'm offering, I'm hoping that it is an amendment that everyone will be able to vote for, especially those that have a pro-choice position. This amendment is simply one that allows the remainder of this act to take effect when the Department of Public Welfare certifies in Pennsylvania Bulletin that there are a sufficient number of foster homes for chemically addicted babies and babies who have been exposed to the AIDS virus. This amendment gives pro-choicers an opportunity to really put your money where your mouth is. It gives you an opportunity to say, yes, I care about life. I care about the unborn crack or the unborn coke or the unborn addict baby. I care about life for every unborn AIDS baby. I care so much about life that I have already made provisions for your life after you are born. It is a fact that most babies who are infected with AIDS from the mother's womb only live 2 years, and they live that life isolated in a hospital, in a dark room, where they're only seen at the time they need care by a nurse who provides their needs and is left alone. There's never anyone to hold, to cuddle, to play, to show them how to walk or to stand. And at the end of 2 years, they expire. No foster home will take them. No one wants to adopt them. And to those who say that the state provides for them already, the state does not provide a loving home for these crack-addicted, cocaine-addicted, or AIDS-infected babies. I urge you to vote for this amendment to give them a chance to have some form of life while they live. Thank you.
Question is on the Bishop Amendment. On that question, Representative Friend from Delaware County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My opposition to this amendment is exactly my opposition to the Heckler Amendment. Absolutely, I'm sure we'll all agree that we would like to see a situation where there are foster homes for all the chemically addicted babies and babies exposed to AIDS, and I'm certain we'll all continue to work toward that goal. But to say that this legislation, none of it, takes effect until that time is to say it's okay to continue to kill unborn children for any reason, and it's okay to waive all of the other provisions assisting the mothers, the husbands, and society until we reach that goal. It doesn't make sense, and I hope that we do with this amendment what we did with the previous amendment, strongly defeated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question is on the amendment. On that question from Allegheny County, Representative Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The gentleman has just simply said that this doesn't make any sense for us really to care about reality other than to get his point across. Basically, what he is simply saying is I only care about one primarily issue and not providing for the cost. It's the same problem that we're going on as far as prisons are concerned. If we want to arrest the people, we do not want to sit down there and provide the prison space. We want to create the problem, but we're not willing to solve the issue. I think that this has been an insult to my good colleague because, again, it's a one-sided issue as far as his point is concerned. If we want to be able to do this, pro-life or pro-choice, it should be our responsibility to be able to provide for the end result. If he really cares, he would support this amendment to provide for the end result of his amendment. I would ask for an affirmative vote for the Bishop Amendment.
The yeas and nays will now be taken on the amendment before us. Members will proceed to vote on the Bishop Amendment. Have all the members present voted? Have all the members voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the Bishop Amendment, the yeas are 40, the nays 160. The amendment fails.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman, Mr. Oliver, for what purpose does the gentleman rise?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think we've had a very extensive vote this evening so far, and therefore, Mr. Speaker, I call for the previous question.
Gentleman, Mr. Oliver from Philadelphia has moved the previous question. Previous question, if successful, will cut off debate on all amendments and on the main question, the amendment that was offered by Mr. Friend, and on the bill that is before us. All of those things will go to immediate votes. The previous question motion takes 20 seconds. Is that correct? Anyone wishing to second the motion for the previous question will stand and be recognized. Clerk will read the Levdansky amendments.
Amendment A 3429, amend Section 2, Section 3205.
On Amendment 3429, the chair recognizes Representative Levdansky.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 1988, over 50,000 abortions were performed in clinics and hospitals throughout the Commonwealth. A quick review of figures would indicate that over 95% of those abortions occurred in clinics and hospitals in 7 counties throughout the Commonwealth. What this indicates is that women in many corners of the state and in many communities in the more rural areas of the state have got to go through significant efforts in terms of time and travel to make it to abortion clinics. Now, under this bill that we're about to approve today, there's an informed consent provision that requires 24 hours in advance for a woman to consult with a doctor, technician, or other certified person to ascertain her rights and her options before the abortion will be performed. Given the fact that so many women must travel so far, I would argue that in many cases an economic and perhaps social hardship is going to be created by the 24-hour informed consent requirement of this legislation. My amendment simply amends the informed consent language to make it clear that the 24-hour requirement will be met through consultation with a doctor or other individual called for in the bill, and that consultation can be performed either in person or by the telephone. That's a very brief explanation of the amendment. I ask for an affirmative vote.
Question is on the amendment. From Delaware County, Representative Friend on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to oppose the amendment. First and most practically, what the informed consent section, which we've overwhelmingly approved, says is, in addition to the doctor advising the woman of the abortion procedure to be used and the dangers of both childbirth and abortion and alternatives, and in addition to an assistant or a counselor providing other information, you have to make available to the woman printed materials. We adopted an amendment by, I think it was Representative Rudy in this regard, to make it even clearer about those printed materials. How can you make printed materials available over the telephone? Yeah, I don't think everybody these days has a fax, and if the argument is that this is an economic, but thank you for the question, this is an economic hardship. Remember one thing. Time and again, women have come to us who have had abortions and said the first time they ever saw a doctor is when they were on the table in the stirrups. Now, you got to remember that we're talking about a big industry. Abortion clinics that are making money and doctors who are making money by performing abortions, the killing of an unborn child. I don't think it's too much to require for a brief period either that referring physician or the doctor performing the abortion to look at that patient and advise her of this information. And as far as the other information is concerned, to have another human being, a counselor, an assistant, a physician's assistant, to provide her this information. The essence here is the printed materials are very important, and we also think the personal contact is extremely important. When you're weighing the issue, the right of a woman to choose and have all of the information, and the issue of killing an unborn child, when you put them together, we're not being onerous with the informed consent section, which we've approved, which is virtually identical to what we approved in 1982, and I sincerely hope we defeat the Levdansky amendment. Thank you.
On the amendment, Representative Levdansky seek additional recognition.
Yes,
He is in order. May proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, also want to point out in the language that's been presently improved, it points out under the informed consent provisions of Section 3205, at least 24 hours prior to the abortion, the physician who is to perform the abortion or the referring physician has orally informed the woman of, and it goes on to list certain specifics. I would argue that orally informed could be broadly interpreted by the courts to include telephonic communication. I'm just trying to make clear that consent, the informed consent, could be met through telephone communication. Representative Friend is also correct in terms of the information, the brochures and other things that are to be provided to the woman prior to her giving consent for the abortion. If she feels that strongly that she wants that information, there's nothing to prohibit her from gaining that information well in advance of 24 hours. I would also like to point out that whether or not she reviews that material according to the amendment already adopted is entirely her choice. Again, I would urge an affirmative vote. Point out that whether or not she reviews that material according to the amendment already adopted is entirely her choice. Again, I would urge an affirmative vote. Thank you.
On the amendment, yeas and nays will now be taken. Members will proceed to vote. Have all members present voted? Have all the members voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the amendment, the yeas are 62, the nays 139. The amendment fails. Question is, will the House agree to the bill? On that question, Chair recognizes for Amendment 3340 from Montgomery County, Representative Reber. Clerk will read the amendment.
It's Amendment A 3340. Amend Section 4, Section 3211.
On the amendment from Montgomery County, Representative Reber.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at the outset, before you start the clock, I'd ask that you put on the 4-minute run as opposed to the 2-minute run, because I do believe we have an amendment before us that is different than has been expressed here tonight, a different subject matter, and I would like to spend approximately 3.5 to 4 minutes discussing it.
Gentleman is in order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the amendment before us at this present time takes into consideration the language in the bill that has already been changed since its initial circulation to us by the prime sponsor, from the necessity of 2 concurring physician opinions to 1 concurring physician opinion, when in fact there is an abortion to be carried out after the 24-week period. The reason I offer this amendment is solely because, as a result of the public hearings held by the House Judiciary Committee on this matter, testimony from a professional in the field came before that committee and advised us that at the time of the hearing, there are at least 27 counties in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that would not be in a position to even provide the necessary concurring opinions because of lack of professionally licensed doctors with a specialization as an OBGYN to handle this particular task. More importantly, in 8 counties in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, there are no doctors whatsoever that could even begin to render such a concurring opinion at all. Mr. Speaker, we've heard the prime sponsor speak about the Webster test, the Webster test being a rational basis test. I would submit for the record and for part of legislative intent that there is no rational basis for the imposition into a state statute of factual requirements that cannot, in fact, pragmatically or factually be carried out in approximately 42% of the counties of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. More importantly, Mr. Speaker, I would submit that the prime sponsor has said that there is a need for this concurring opinion because there is conflict or the potential of conflict between the unborn child as well as the pregnant woman. I would submit that we are talking about situations where a second physician is already, under law, required to be present to handle that particular premature delivery that could take place under current law in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I would submit that that argument has no bearing in this particular debate. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, I think it is unfortunate that we should require a pregnant woman who is undergoing this procedure because of death threats or substantial and irreversible impairment of her bodily functions to require something that is not required of any other procedure, operative procedure in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Just think how the governor of this Commonwealth, when he had to undergo a life-threatening heart surgery situation, would have been feeling if he had to go out and get concurring opinions in writing. He didn't have to do it. I would submit that a pregnant woman should not have to also seek out a concurring opinion. Additionally, we're talking about a death and/or, the new language, substantial and irreversible impairment situation. We may not have time to find that particular person. Well, the sponsor's going to say that there's emergency language. I would submit that if I'm a doctor with malpractice rates the way they are in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I'm going to look for that second concurring opinion before I'm the doctor that's performing the operation. In short, Mr. Speaker, I think we have a situation where we already license physicians. We already have qualified individuals licensed to practice in this area. Let's let that particular person, in conjunction with that particular doctor's patient, make that determination as heretofore. We have the protection of the second physician having to be on hand in the event that there is, in fact, a premature delivery with a viable child. We have all bases covered. The sponsor has already backtracked on this one. I think he was beginning to recognize the aspect that this would not be a rational basis for legislative enactment. I would submit, Mr. Speaker, and I submit for the record, the testimony of Dr. Dartman, who testified before the House Judiciary Committee, documentation of what I have hereby said. May I submit this for the record?
Gentleman's remarks, so the text that the gentleman has can be submitted for the record. You are in order. Question is on the Reber Amendment 3340. On that question, from Delaware County, Representative Friend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to oppose the amendment. You know what's interesting? You can't win. If, in fact, your feet are carved in cement and you don't move, you're dogmatic and doctrinaire. If, in fact, you listen to concerns and respond, then you're backtracking. We, in fact, made an accommodation where we said instead of 2 concurring opinions, just 1. We thought that was appropriate. Now look at the safeguards. Number 1, in the case of a medical emergency, all of that's waived. But number 2, when you're talking about the fact that you can't get a second doctor, remember this, we're talking about abortions after 24 weeks. And except in the most severe emergency when everything's waived, that's going to be performed in a hospital. The clinics have testified they don't do them at 24 weeks. So you don't have a problem with a second physician. And I repeat, you give the example of Governor Casey. He didn't have a conflict between his heart and the rest of his body. This is unique. The killing of an unborn child through abortion is unique. It's the only area where a doctor has a potential conflict between 2 patients, the unborn baby and the mother, because of the exceptions we have in there, because of the safeguards we have in there, and because of the accommodation we've already made, going from 2 concurring physicians to 1. I think we have outstanding legislation which we've already approved, and I sincerely hope that we defeat this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question is on the amendment, and on that question, yeas and nays will now be taken. Members will proceed to vote. Have all the members voted? Have all members voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the amendment, the yeas are 60, the nays 139. The amendment fails. Chair recognizes for Amendment 3453 the lady from Lehigh County, Representative Ritter. Clerk will read the amendment.
It's Amendment A 3453. Amend Section 4, Section 3211.
On Amendment 3453, the chair recognizes the author from Lehigh County, Representative Ritter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment is again drawn to the section on abortions after 24 weeks dealing with the suicide issue. We are striking the language that's currently in the bill regarding the suicide language, and we are substituting that a woman's threat of suicide would not meet the requirements of the section unless a psychiatrist or psychologist has certified in writing that that professional reasonably believes that the mental health of the woman has been impaired to the point where that woman might attempt to commit suicide, or that the woman has, in fact, attempted to commit suicide. So we're making clear that we're not punishing women who have already tried to kill themselves or who have been diagnosed by a professional who certifies in writing that they may attempt to commit suicide. So we're not talking now about a woman who walks into the doctor's office and says, I'm going to kill myself if I have to have this child. We're talking about people who have been, women who have been diagnosed or who have in fact attempted to commit suicide, and we would like to make it clear that they are protected in terms of being allowed to make the decision about abortion in those events to protect their lives, and I would ask for an affirmative vote.
Question is on the amendment offered. Representative Friend from Delaware County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the language we have right now is outstanding. In some respects, I can't believe this amendment because a physician or psychiatrist would certify that because a woman might be suicidal, and we're talking about after 24 weeks, it's okay to have her unborn baby killed. Now, remember what we said at the beginning. We're talking about abortion, an inherently violent act, the killing of an unborn baby. If there's a diagnosis that a woman is suicidal, she needs help. And help isn't killing her unborn baby. She needs assistance. The killing of her unborn baby doesn't provide that assistance. The killing of her 6-month or older unborn baby doesn't provide that assistance. That's not compassionate. That's not caring about women. That's not providing to the mother the help that she needs. This is not an amendment that is compassionate both for the unborn baby, he'll be killed, but particularly for the mother. I sincerely hope that we reject it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question is on the amendment. On that question from Lehigh County, Representative Ritter.
Unless someone else wanted to go first. All right. Again, we're not talking about killing the unborn child. We're talking about an early delivery to prevent this woman from committing suicide. Now, I would suggest to you that if this woman in fact commits suicide, she has killed not only herself, but her unborn child. And what we are trying to do is prevent that from happening by allowing the physician to deliver this child early. We're not talking about killing. We're not talking about saline abortions. Again, we are talking about, because the provisions are still there, that we're talking about induced delivery or C-sections and allowing the physician to make that judgment. And I would ask again for an affirmative vote.
From Bucks County, Representative Clymer.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am confused about this amendment as well, because in the testimony that I have heard of young women who were suicidal, it was after they had the abortion that they thought about what they had done and became very upset and had symptoms of being suicidal. So this is very confusing. All I can say is that I'm going to vote against the amendment.
On the amendment, Representative Friend from Delaware County for the second time.
One other issue that has to be made clear. If we're talking about a, quote, early delivery, we're not talking about an abortion. If, in fact, the determination is made that the woman is in such a stage of her pregnancy that there's at least a 50% chance for survival for the unborn baby, then the definition of abortion no longer applies and the whole section's irrelevant anyway. This only deals with respect to an abortion, the killing of an unborn baby. So that argument by Representative Ritter absolutely doesn't apply. Once again, I urge defeat of the Ritter amendment.
From Berks County, Representative Lay.
Mr. Speaker, very briefly speaking on the amendment, suicide is a psychological problem, and no psychological problem has ever been cured by an abortion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yeas and nays will now be taken on the amendment. Members will proceed to vote. Have all members present voted? Have all members voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the amendment, the yeas are 49, the nays 151. The amendment is not agreed to. For Amendment 3451, the chair recognizes Representative Ritter, and the clerk will read Amendment 3451.
It's Amendment A 3451. Amend title, page 1, lines 2 through 7.
On the amendment, Representative Ritter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment is very simple. Technical change, as Mr. Friend would say. It deletes all of the language contained in the bill and substitutes the language from the Reproductive Privacy Act, which is also House Bill 1874, and I would ask for your support.
Question is on the amendment of Representative Ritter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Friend from Delaware County is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, I oppose. Representative Ritter was straightforward. It entirely guts our bill and gives absolute blank check, unrestricted abortion on demand at any time for any reason. I sincerely hope we overwhelmingly defeat it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question is on the amendment.
Mr. Speaker.
On that question, Representative Ritter.
Again, if you're listening to Representative Friend, you're being lied to. The Reproductive Privacy Act is not abortion on demand for any reason at any time. It provides restrictions after viability. So let's be clear about our terms. We are talking about a woman's right to make a choice up to the point of viability, and after viability there are restrictions to preserve maternal life or health, and I would again ask for an affirmative vote.
Question is on the amendment.
Mr. Speaker.
Question.
Mr. Speaker.
From Berks County, Representative Gallen.
Mr. Speaker, either the maker of this amendment has lost touch with reality or she's being extremely frivolous. I don't think she can see what's happening here. She's wasting our time offering silly amendments like this, and let's get on with the business of the House.
Yeas and nays will now be taken on the amendment. Members will proceed to vote. Have all members voted? Have all the members present voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the amendment, the yeas are 54, the nays 146. That amendment fails. Information that the Speaker has is that Representative Pitts is withdrawing the amendment we had him listed for. Is that correct? Chair thanks the gentleman. For Amendment 3370, Representative Heckler is withdrawing. Amendment 3387, Representative Paccola is withdrawing the same. Who else would like to withdraw? I'll take any number. Here's your chance. Representative Pitts, 3403. Withdrawn. Representative Heckler, Amendment 3370 and 3361. Withdrawn. Representative Paccola, 3387. Withdrawn. Representative Chadwick, 3420. Withdrawn. Representative Haggerty, Amendment 3339. Withdrawn. Representative Kukovic, 3359. Withdrawn. Representative Paccola, 3349. Withdrawn. Representative Preston, 3357. Withdrawn. Representative Josephs, 3380. Withdrawn. Representative Joseph, 3366, withdrawn. Representative Paccola, 3452, withdrawn.
The second Linton one.
Linton, 3439, withdrawn. Representative Ritter, 3413, withdrawn. 3451, Representative Ritter, withdrawn. Representative Ritter, 3453, withdrawn. Representative Josephs, 3450. Withdrawn. Representative Don Snyder, 3463. Withdrawn? Offering the amendment. Chair asks the clerk to read the Snyder Amendment 3463.
It's Amendment A 3463. Amend Section 1, Section 3203, page 1.
The question is on that amendment. 3463, the chair recognizes Representative Snyder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know what the outcome will probably be, but I think this is a fundamental question that has to at least go on the record. The majority leader has spoken about an hour and a half ago about when does life begin and the problem that we have of theoretically defining that. This bill makes that decision for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania by saying that life begins as an unborn child at the time of fertilization, which is at the time of the contact of the sperm and the ovum. Mr. Speaker, I think that this has many implications that were pointed out in the Webster case, in which this very language that we are now changing the definitions was placed in the preamble of the Missouri law. The Supreme Court noted various concerns about that language, but was able to avoid the issue because it was in the preamble rather than in the body of the statute itself. The intent of the sponsor of this legislation is to test the Supreme Court, and what they are doing is taking this issue and making it one of those tests. Mr. Speaker, this definition would define the pregnancy and fertilization differently than what the maker of the Act presently requires. Presently, Mr. Speaker, if this Act goes into effect, it would basically prohibit in vitro fertilization in the sense that the joinder of the sperm and the ovum in the Petri dish would constitute an unborn child under this law. And under the Abortion Control Act, as it presently is in Pennsylvania already, the unborn child will be entitled to the same laws that any other person is entitled to in Pennsylvania. Mr. Speaker, that is giving rights to the fertilized egg in the Petri dish. I'll hold for the end.
Question is on the amendment. On that question, Representative Friend from Delaware County.
Mr. Speaker, I strongly oppose this amendment. Every abortion bill we've ever had in the definition of an unborn baby says life begins at conception. Now, we're not alone on this. At least 7 current medical dictionaries equate these terms: life beginning at conception, fertilization of the ovum by the spermatozoon, Blackstone's, Tabor's, Mossby's, Butterworth's Medical Dictionary, and a host of others. Nothing that we've done in our legislation
For that, you owe me one.
in any way impinges upon in vitro fertilization. In fact, present law specifically says that it's legal. The only thing we require is reporting on the in vitro fertilization. But this comes down to a fundamental issue which we've always stood for before. Normally, that when that sperm is united with the egg and that single human cell is created, that is when life begins. I hope that we always adhere to that, and because of that, I hope we defeat the Snyder Amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question is on the Snyder Amendment, and on that question, Representative Josephs from Philadelphia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also did a little bit of medical research, and I also looked at the present definition in our present statute, which the maker of this amendment seeks to change. In our present statute, we use the word mitosis, differentiation, and development. I believe the present statute talks about conception as a process. And when I look into my medical text, I see that it is a process that can last for up to a week. Conception and fertilization, according to this medical testimony and according to what we have in the bill, is a process. It is not an instantaneous act. The maker of the amendment has caught something very subtle. He has seen that this is another subtle attack on the use of various contraceptive methods and devices which work during the week that fertilization, mitosis, differentiation, and development, all words that are in our underlying act, is taking place. I think that a vote against this amendment is a vote against contraceptive devices and methods that are commonly used by many, many of our constituents. If I'm running to the end, I'd like to go ahead with my other 2 minutes, please.
Lady has used her first 2 minutes. Is in order to continue for an additional 2 minutes.
Again, I will tell you that doctors generally advise their patients when they give them certain contraceptive pills that if they forget to take their pill on Monday or Tuesday, they should take a double dose on Wednesday and Thursday, and they'll be protected from pregnancy. If we believe legally that conception and fertilization happen in one instant, you are putting yourself in the position of making contraceptive pills and perhaps the intrauterine device illegal for your constituents. And your constituents will know that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sure, thanks, lady. From York County, Representative Foster on the question of whether the House will adopt the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have listened for years to this debate on when a child is not a child and when a life is not a life, when indeed life begins. And I have to ask myself the question, if there is anyone out there that can conceive and bring forth anything but a child, I will debate the issue no longer. I'll steal away into the night. I ask for a negative vote on this amendment.
Question is on the amendment. On that question, Representative Snyder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is probably the most important issue of the bill, and to try to develop a decent argument in 2 minutes is next to impossible. But no one is disputing that life is in the unfertilized egg, and that the life process begins with the sperm and the egg together. But, Mr. Speaker, medically, 20 to 30% of the fertilized eggs never make it to implantation. Is that the death of an unborn child? Mr. Speaker, in Roe v. Wade, the court recognized this distinction. Just like to read briefly from the opinion, we held in Griswold that the states may not preclude spouses from attempting to avoid the joinder of sperm and egg. That's dealing with the contraception issue, which just raises some questions about. The court goes on, if this is true, it is difficult to perceive any overriding public necessity which might attach precisely at the moment of conception. As Mr. Justice Clark has said, to say that life is present at conception is to give recognition to the potential rather than the actual. The unfertilized egg has life, and if fertilized, it takes on human proportions. But the law, again, which is what we're dealing with, but the law deals in reality, not obscurity, the known rather than the unknown. When sperm meets egg, life may eventually form, but quite often it does not. The law does not deal in speculation. The phenomenon of life takes time to develop, and until it is actually present, it cannot be destroyed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sure, thanks, the gentleman. The yeas and nays will now be taken on the amendment. Members will proceed to vote. Have all members voted? Have all the members present voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the amendment, the yeas are 59, the nays 139. The amendment fails. Question is, will the House agree to the bill? And on that question, Representative Hughes indicates that Amendment 3461 is to be offered. The clerk will read the amendment.
It's Amendment A 3461. Amend title, page 1, line 7.
On the question of whether the House will adopt the amendment, the chair recognizes from Philadelphia County Representative Hughes.
Mr. Speaker, should I run over my 2 minutes? I'd like it to continue. Thank you.
Thank you.
This amendment, number A 3461, is the same language as House Bill 1875. It provides that a medically necessary abortion shall be funded in the same manner and to the same extent as any other medically necessary procedure as provided under Pennsylvania's Medical Assistance Program. Amendment A 3461 stipulates that the Commonwealth shall not discriminate against any person by denying or conditioning the receipt of any form of aid, assistance, benefits, programs, facilities, contracts, or services based on, number one, a woman's decision to obtain birth control or an abortion, number two, a person's lawful advocacy for availability of abortion or contraception, or number three, a person's decision to provide or refuse to provide abortion or contraceptive services. This amendment should be known as the Women's Health Equity Act. It provides for the same access to reproductive health service for poor women as rich women have. The amendment states that poor women in Erie, Crawford, Mercer, Venango, and Warren counties are equal in status and have the same access to health care services as rich women. The amendment states that poor women who live in Bradford, Susquehanna, Wayne, Lackawanna, and Wyoming counties must not be treated any differently than rich women. Amendment A 3461 states that poor women who live in Greene, Washington, Fayette, Beaver, and Westmoreland counties have the same right of self-determination as rich women. Amendment A 3461 states that poor women living in Forest, Elk, Cameron, Clinton, and Lycoming counties who suffer from diabetes or cancer have the same opportunity to increase health risks to themselves as rich women have. And that poor women who live in Armstrong, Jefferson, Union, Northumberland, and Schuylkill counties who have AIDS and who are pregnant can be provided the same services as rich women. When abortion services for poor women living in counties like Pike, Potter, and Franklin, and Mr. Speaker, my time is over. Wind up. All right.
No,
in Franklin, we're cut
you're
off
2 minutes up. You have another 2 minutes.
Birth rates across the state increased 32.7%. Poor women in Carbon, Tioga, and Lawrence counties are having children they do not want, and the state refuses to find the money and the compassion to take care of those children. Why must a poor woman who lives in Huntington County be discriminated against because of her lack of wealth? That's not what Pennsylvania is supposed to stand for. Why must a poor woman who lives in Chester County have her health jeopardized only because she is poor? Why must a poor woman who lives in Montour County and is carrying a Tay-Sachs fetus doomed to die have to live through that pain? Why must a poor woman who lives in Mifflin County force herself and force this state to bear the financial burden that neither can afford? Why does a poor woman who lives in Juniata County have to resort to inducing an abortion through cocaine, coat hangers, or 5 packs of birth control pills? Since 1985, roughly 10,000 women per year have been denied abortion services simply because they are poor. Birth rates have increased, infant mortality rates have increased, and Pennsylvania's costs for the care of unwanted children have increased. Amendment A 3461 is an attempt to correct the injustice and discrimination that has been placed on poor people in this state. We have taken this geography tour of the state, Mr. Speaker, to show that poor women who live in each one of the 67 counties, in each of the 50 senatorial districts, in each of the 203 legislative districts in Pennsylvania, and not just those who live in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, are suffering dramatically and unfairly when it comes to their reproductive health. We are seeking that this state government have the same sense of fairness and compassion as the governments of New York and Maryland, and we are asking that this House of Representatives provide leadership for the lost, hope for the hopeless, and equity for everyone by removing the burden of poverty and discrimination off the backs of poor women and their families, and letting the warm sun of equality be accessible to each and every
Gentleman's time is up.
Of this Commonwealth. Thank you very much.
From Philadelphia, the chair recognizes Representative Josephs on the amendment.
Ladies and gentlemen, I support this amendment, and I support it because it's unfair to pick on poor women. We have heard many times, I have heard many times, those people whose sole object it is to recriminalize abortion speak in sanctimonious terms about how they are only saving, they are trying so hard to save the unborn, in their words, unborn babies of poor women, and how privileged those unborn babies are. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that their claim to being the most, in their words, pro-life state in this country is based on their ability to pick on poor women and young women, people who by definition have little power at the polls. I could pick on these populations too. Everybody could pick on these populations. But let me also point out that the bill that we're considering affects every woman, middle-class women, working women, rich women, women who are going to pay for these abortions themselves, and women who are mature adults. I hope when you face these women and the men who care for them in your district, you're able to explain to them why you put up these votes against them. And I hope they understand that they must return to you the disrespect that you have shown to them at the polls. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the amendment from Delaware County, Representative Friend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to oppose the amendment, and I hope it's clear to all of you what the amendment does. It undoes what we did in 1980 when we overwhelmingly passed the Medicaid funding cutoff. Went through a 5-year court battle, went into effect in 1985 after we won all the court challenges. Prior to that time, a woman who qualified economically in Pennsylvania could have an abortion for any reason because of the definition of health. We funded $13,000 a year. After the Medicaid funding cutoff, we were only funding those necessary to save the life of the mother and in cases of rape and incest. And in point of fact, after we made rape and incest reportable to law enforcement agencies, the number now, instead of $13,000 a year, is less than 100. I find it very interesting about this group called Choice issued a report that said, since the Medicaid funding cutoff, many women are having later-term abortions because it's necessary for them to save their money. And as I indicated before, this only confirms what we've known all along. Abortion is an industry. There are pro-life doctors throughout the state who consistently provide services to women who choose life for free. But on the other side, the doctors who are supposed to benefit the women with this procedure won't do it unless the money's up front. If we pass this amendment, what we go back to is unwitting birth control by abortion on demand funded by the taxpayers, more than $13,000 a year. I hope we reject this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the amendment, yeas and nays will now be taken. Members will proceed to vote. Have all members voted? Have all the members present voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the amendment, the yeas are 41, the nays 158. The amendment fails. Will the House agree to the bill? Representative Brogus from Cumberland County indicates that there is an amendment to be offered. Clerk will read Amendment 3469.
It's Amendment A 3469. Amend Section 4, Section 3211, page 7.
On the amendment, Representative Brogus.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this amendment provides for several situations in which the 24-week restriction creates or doesn't permit. For instance, in the matter of incest and rape, arbitrarily the 24-week period has said that there can only be an abortion in the event of risk of death or the substantial impairment. I'm going to read a portion of the Webster decision. We've heard a lot of the Webster decision. It's been quoted, and shall we say it's been quoted for its purpose, but it says, the rigid trimester analysis of the course of a pregnancy enunciated in Roe has resulted in subsequent cases making constitutional law in this area a virtual dilemma. In addition, it says, in the first place, the rigid Roe framework is hardly consistent with the notion of a constitution cast in general terms as ours is. And what do we have? We have a Webster decision that in fact calls for a viability or permits and recognizes a viability test. And we have in Representative Friend's bill a rigid 24-week period. That is in fact the antithesis of the Webster decision. Now, Representative Friend has done an excellent, very admirable job in giving us a specific standard, and I applaud him for using the language of a substantial impairment of a major bodily function. That's a good test, but that test has with it a test that physicians would have difficulty in applying, and that is the irreversibility. It's difficult enough to get any opinion out of a physician without giving him such a difficult term as irreversible. My amendment has tried and true terms such as a substantial impairment where such impairment causes permanent disability. That permanent disability, I think Representative Friend would accept because it is a high test, permanent disability. It avoids the use of that very difficult term, irreversibility, and it uses a better term of partial disability. And I'd ask that this amendment be accepted.
Question is on the amendment. On that question, Representative Friend.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to oppose this amendment for two reasons. Number one, once again, it weakens what we have determined to be a reasonable standard after 24 weeks, to avert the death of the mother or in cases of substantial and irreversible impairment of major bodily function. Now, I assume in this amendment there's a drafting error where it says disability and it should be or partial disability. What's partial disability mean? For a period of not less than a year. So once again, it's another attempt to weaken the accommodation we've already made. And please remember, and I don't want to be redundant, what we're trying to do is weigh life and health here. The second thing it does is bring in rape and incest. Now, I am aware there are many members, if Roe versus Wade is overturned, who will vote to outlaw abortions, but will want a rape and incest exception. That day isn't here, and we're only talking about abortions after 24 weeks. A 6-month unborn baby or older. The argument in favor of abortions for rape and incest are that the result of these heinous crimes, the woman is forced to carry the baby. We're talking about at least a 6-month-old baby where the woman has already carried that unborn baby for more than 2/3 of her pregnancy. The only result, therefore, that can be is to kill that unborn baby. It may well be at the appropriate time the majority of this legislature will feel that there's a place for a rape and incest exception. But it certainly isn't after 24 weeks where we're talking about a 6-month unborn baby. For those reasons, because it once again attempts to dilute the reasonable standard weighing health against life, and because secondly, it doesn't make sense when we're talking about a baby this old, a baby, a well-developed baby. I sincerely hope that we reject this amendment. Thank you.
Question is on the amendment.
My last 2 minutes, Mr. Speaker.
On that question, Representative Brogus is recognized for the
First of all, Representative Friend knows that FOR is simply an editorial change that can be made. We don't need a ruling on that, and this House doesn't need it, and he nods yes. The second thing is that we have, in the 24-week period, an arbitrary standard that has been set in this bill, which is contrary to the very decision, the very conservative decision, that Representative Friend wants to rely on. And what he's doing to the Supreme Court is going to back him to the wall for the purpose of having them rule on an arbitrary 24 weeks. What we've done here is provide for that very limited situation where the rape or incest may occur. Now the question is, how many occur? And we know that there's only about 127 abortions that took place in the 20 to 24 week period out of 50,000 abortions last year. And let me ask you, how many of those were rape or incest? The number would be relatively small, if any. The point is that in that heinous situation where incest occurs, where the extraordinary circumstances of the difficulty of disclosure occur, that here we have an opportunity for that one small window of opportunity for a person that's a victim of incest to come forward and meet the very reasonable tests of this bill. Finally, my standard of substantial impairment is slightly less than Representative Friend's and much more onerous than Representative Ritter's. And what I'm saying is that you voted 40, 60, 65, 70, 90 votes in favor of a test that is less than that irreversible standard that Representative Friend has. And this is your opportunity to vote for a test that's not as severe as irreversible and not as liberal as Representative Ritter's bills. I give you an opportunity to vote on this to give a chance for a person that is substantially impaired, but not irreversibly impaired, where there is a permanent disability or a partial disability, to have that abortion, and it's going to be very small. I ask for an affirmative vote.
Question is, will the House agree to the amendment? And on that question, yeas and nays will now be taken. Members will proceed to vote. Have all members voted? Have all the members present voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the amendment, the yeas are 63, the nays 137. That amendment fails. Question is, will the House agree to the bill? The gentleman from Philadelphia, Mr. Linton, indicates that Amendment 3471 is ready for the members of the House. The clerk will read that amendment.
It's Amendment A 3471. Amend title, page 1, line 6.
Will the House agree to this amendment? From Philadelphia County, Representative Linton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, throughout this evening, we have set through the Abortion Control Act some procedures that would not allow many women in this Commonwealth to move forth with abortions. Yet, if I would like to refer to some language that is currently in our current Abortion Control Act, where it says that it is the intention of the General Assembly of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to protect hereby the life and health of the woman and subject to abortion, and to protect the life and health of the child subject to abortion. With that, Mr. Speaker, we have provided under informed consent, we have informed the women of this Commonwealth that prior to getting an abortion, that medical benefits will be made available to them. Under this amendment, we seek to provide to those women that state cash benefits will be made available to them. We also seek to inform those women that women may choose to seek abortions because they fear that they will be unable to financially support a child until the child reaches the age of maturity. We're acknowledging that there are findings that indicate that there are women in this Commonwealth that sometimes seek to have abortions because they recognize that they cannot financially support that child through maturity. So we therefore are saying that if, in fact, that woman cannot have that abortion, that we will provide information on the availability of medical benefits. But in addition to that, this amendment purports that we will provide, asking for another 2 minutes, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman is in order to speak his second 2-minute period.
That we are providing the availability of cash benefits. But in addition to that, we're stating that those cash benefits will be made available of 100% of the current federal established poverty level. That is, in fact, what we're intending to do. If we're insisting that the women of this Commonwealth must have abortion, if we are insisting that the women in this Commonwealth must continue to have children when they seek to have abortions, we must also insist that we provide financial support for those children through maturity. I'm asking for an affirmative vote on this amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Question is on the Linton Amendment. On that question from Delaware County, Representative Friend.
I hope we take a good look at this language. Number one, there's no economic guideline at all. If a woman certifies that she has foregone an abortion and chooses to carry her baby, she shall be entitled to receive cash benefits of not less than 100% of the federally established poverty level, regardless of how much she makes, regardless of how much she presently makes. It penalizes, however, the woman who has never considered abortion whatsoever, regardless of her economic circumstance. Even if she's poor, she doesn't get a thing. This amendment is absolutely ludicrous. Now, once again, we've got to always try to do better with respect to how we help our citizens within our budgetary constraints. But there's no income limitations here. A woman could be making $50,000 a year, and she's entitled to receive those benefits. And the woman who never considers abortion, she doesn't receive a penny. I hope that we overwhelmingly defeat this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
From Lehigh County, Representative McHale on the amendment.
Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman, Mr. Linton, stand for interrogation?
Gentleman indicates he will. You may proceed.
Mr. Linton, I just listened to the gentleman, Mr. Friend, in which he indicated that there were no financial limits being placed regarding the eligibility of the woman for such funding. But when I look at your amendment, I see the phrase on page 3, if she is eligible for public assistance. Would you clarify that situation?
That's absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. It's clear that we are only speaking to those women who are eligible for public assistance. In addition, on page 2, it says state cash benefits may be available for the entire household. May be available, and it may be available only based upon their eligibility for public assistance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I speak on the amendment?
Gentleman is in order.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in vigorous support of the Linton Amendment. Unlike two earlier amendments, which made the implementation of Representative Friend's amendment contingent upon the solution to various inequities that we perceive in our society, and I specifically refer to the Heckler Amendment and the Bishop Amendment, this does not make the effectiveness of the Friend Amendment contingent on anything. This is, Mr. Speaker, in my opinion, a test of our sincerity. Now, throughout most of the afternoon and early evening, I have voted with Mr. Friend to protect unborn life. The question now before the House is, should any woman be so poor that she chooses abortion? If you believe that that is not an imposition to be placed on any woman in this Commonwealth, that no woman should be so poor that she chooses abortion, you should then vote for the Linton Amendment. This says that if we encourage women to carry their pregnancies to full term, that when those children are born, we will, if the family is unable to financially provide for that child, provide public support to guarantee that the child will not live in poverty. This is a question of our integrity. My 2 additional minutes, Mr. Speaker, and I'll conclude. This is a question of whether we really mean what we have voted all afternoon. I support the protection of unborn life, but I also believe that once that child is born, it should not have to live in poverty. I urge an affirmative vote for the Linton Amendment.
Question is on the amendment.
Mr. Speaker.
On that question, Representative Friend for the second time.
Not to belabor this, but all a woman has to do is certify. And what she then receives, because she would have had an abortion and does not, she then receives a much higher rate of income than someone on public assistance, because it's now up to the federal poverty level, if she says that she would have considered an abortion. And we don't do a thing for the equally poor woman who would never consider the killing of her unborn child because of economic circumstances. Now, when we're talking about discrimination, that is discrimination at its most. Sure, there's a need to improve what we're doing, and we try to do that every year, and we'll keep trying. But this isn't the way to do it. I ask for defeat of this amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Question is
Thank
on
you.
the amendment, and on that question, yeas and nays will now be taken. Members will proceed to vote. Have all members voted? Have all the members present voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the amendment, the yeas are 48, the nays 151. The amendment fails. Will the House agree to the bill as amended? On that question, Representative Stairs indicates that Amendment 3470 is prepared and ready for the House. Clerk will read the amendment.
It's Amendment A 3470. Amend title, page 1, line 7.
On the question of whether the House will adopt Amendment 3470, Chair recognizes from Westmoreland County Representative Stairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the afternoon and evening hours, we've heard much debate, much divisive debate on philosophical differences, emotional differences. I offer this amendment to bring us together. The grounds that I'm doing that is for children. If you're pro-life, certainly you want to provide the children that we give life to opportunities. If you're pro-choice, the children that are deprived, you want to provide opportunities to them. This bill, this amendment, offers a appropriation of $1 million for subsidized daycare and $2 million to increase the salaries of workers who are very grossly underpaid in subsidized daycare. And of course, the subsidized daycare also provides service to children who do not receive subsidies. So many children will have the benefit of this legislation if we can offer this amendment to this bill.
Chair recognizes the Majority Leader, Representative O'Donnell.
Mr. Speaker, a point of order.
Gentleman's point of order.
I would challenge the germaneness of this amendment.
Gentleman has indicated that in the opinion of the Majority Leader, the amendment is not germane. Germaneness is a question for the members of the House to decide. We are working today with a Title 18 bill, which is the Crimes Code bill, and the question is whether or not the amendment offered making appropriations of money for daycare and salary increases is germane, and that question is for the House. On that question, Representative Ryan.
Mr. Speaker, we have this evening handled a number of bills. We've taken them up, although they've never been questioned, with respect to funding of various things. The legislative intent on Chapter 32 of Purdon's, I don't know the Purdon's number, but it's the Abortion Control Act, makes reference to the following. It is the intention of the General Assembly of the Commonwealth to protect hereby the life and health of the woman subject to abortion and to protect the life and health of the child subject to abortion. I think based on that, it's clear that the Abortion Control Act does more than just give us an opportunity to regulate people's lives. It also gives us an opportunity to subsidize daycare and take care of those obligations that we have here in the Commonwealth. This particular amendment offered by the gentleman, Mr. Stairs, appropriates $3 million to the Department of Public Welfare until June of 1990, allocated to subsidize daycare and for salary increases for daycare workers. I believe it to be an appropriate amendment. I believe it to be germane to the issue before us, and I would ask that we vote yes on that question. Thank you, sir.
The question is on germaneness. On that question, the Majority Leader, Representative O'Donnell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I respectfully disagree with the Minority Leader and congratulate him on his ingenuity. The standard of germaneness that we have used in this House traditionally has been that it must be relevant to an amendment to the code that is under consideration. The code here is the criminal code. The gentleman characterized our efforts as regulating people's lives, and he recited a phrase from the preamble, so to speak, of the Abortion Control Act, which made reference to the health of children and women. By the gentleman's standards, anything that affected women or anything that affected children or anything that regulated anyone's life would therefore be germane. I think that's a fairly broad standard and one that we probably ought to reject. I think this is clearly not germane, and we should vote it so.
Question is whether or not the matter is germane. Members who believe that the amendment is germane. Gentleman, Mr. Ryan.
Mr. Speaker, on the same subject, in the Crimes Code under the construction of the Act, the following is found. In every relevant civil or criminal proceeding in which it is possible to do so without violating the federal Constitution, common and statutory law of Pennsylvania shall be construed so as to extend to the unborn the protection of the laws and to further the public policy of this Commonwealth encouraging childbirth over abortion. I think part of that is the proper and adequate funding of child care, further, in my judgment, substantiating the earlier argument that this is relevant and is germane to the issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
From York County, Representative Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can sympathize with trying to add on amendments here, but I recognized rather earlier that an amendment that I was party to would be non-germane, and I withdrew it. And I submit that this amendment is equally non-germane, and I don't think we should burden this bill with this type of amendment. So I would strongly urge that we vote the amendment non-germane.
Those voting that the amendment is germane will vote in the affirmative. Those voting that the amendment is not germane will vote in the negative. Members will proceed to vote. Have all the members present voted? Have all the members present voted? The clerk will record the vote. On the question of germaneness, the yeas are 98, the nays 102. The matter has been determined to be non-germane and out of order. Chair has before it a reconsideration filed by gentleman from Philadelphia, Mr. Piefsky, regarding the original Friend Amendment. Amendment 3332. Question is whether or not the House will reconsider that amendment. Members will vote on reconsideration. This is on reconsideration only. The yeas and nays will be taken. Members will proceed to vote on reconsideration of the Friend Amendment. Have all the members present voted? Have all the members present voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of reconsidering the amendment, the yeas are 199, the nays 1. The question of reconsideration has carried, and the question immediately recurs. Will the House agree to the amendment?
Mr. Speaker.
On that question,
Point of parliamentary inquiry.
the gentleman's status point of parliamentary inquiry.
In view of the fact that we have reconsidered the Friend Amendment, what is the status of the amendments to that amendment that were adopted?
The amendments
Are they all erased? They wouldn't be of any effect.
I think we did it all wrong.
I think what he's saying to Clancy right now is
Go back and strangle us.
Chair is advised by the parliamentarian that, assuming that the Friend Amendment is readopted by the House, all of the amendments that have been adopted are also within the bill, and there is no difficulty. If the amendment that Mr. Friend has offered fails at this time, all of the amendments that have been adopted become irrelevant, having nothing to attach to.
Therefore, the reconsideration of the Friend Amendment was the reconsideration of the amendment as amended.
The chair does not necessarily agree with that interpretation.
Mr. Speaker, I'm still at a loss as to whether or not we by that vote, reconsidering all the amendments that were adopted.
We are reconsidering the Friend Amendment as Mr. Friend offered it and as this House adopted it.
Without the other amendments.
Without the other amendments. On that question, which immediately recurs, the yeas and nays will now be taken. Members will proceed to vote on the Friend Amendment. Have all the members present voted? Get them up there. Clerk will record the vote. On whether or not the House will adopt the Friend Amendment, 33-32. The yeas are 142, the nays 59. The amendment has been adopted. Chair has before it a reconsideration motion on the Heckler Amendment, 3341. The reconsideration motion is presented by Representative Brogus. Question is, will the House reconsider the vote on Amendment 3341, which was defeated earlier this day? Members will vote on reconsideration. Yeas and nays will now be taken on reconsideration. Have all the members present voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of reconsideration, the yeas are 197, the nays 1. The amendment is to be reconsidered. The question is, will the House agree to the bill as amended? We have before us an amendment being offered by Representative Heckler, Amendment A, 3341. Question immediately recurs, will the House adopt that amendment? Do you insist on being heard again? The yeas and nays will now be taken. Members will proceed to vote. Have all members voted? Have all the members present voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the amendment, the yeas are 78, the nays 123. For the second time, the House has defeated the amendment. Chair has before it a reconsideration motion on the Murphy Amendment, Amendment 3432. The motion is that the Amendment 3432, which was defeated earlier this day, be reconsidered. Question is on the motion for reconsideration. On that motion, members will proceed to vote. Yeas and nays will be taken. Have all members voted on the reconsideration? On the reconsideration, and if all members voted, clerk will record the vote. On the question of reconsideration, the yeas are 199, the nays 1. The House has determined that the amendment will be reconsidered. Question is, will the House agree to the bill as amended? And on that question, Representative Murphy offers Amendment 3432. Question immediately recurs on Amendment 3432. Will the House agree to the amendment? Yeas and nays will now be taken. Members will proceed to vote. Have all members present voted? Have all the members present voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the Murphy Amendment, the yeas are 73, the nays 128. The amendment has been defeated. Chair has before it a reconsideration motion on Amendment 3477. The motion by Ms. Ritter is that Amendment 3477, which was defeated earlier today, be reconsidered. Question is on the reconsideration motion. The yeas and nays will be taken. Members will proceed to vote. Have all members voted on the reconsideration motion? On the question of reconsideration, have all members voted? Clerk will record the vote. The yeas are 199, the nays 2. The House has determined that the matter of the amendment should be reconsidered. Question is, will the House agree to the bill as amended? And on that question, Amendment A 3332 is being offered by Representative Ritter. Clerk will read the amendment. I'm sorry, 3477 is the amendment.
It's Amendment A 3477. Amend Section 4, Section 3211, page 7.
On that question, Representative Ritter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Very briefly, I want to point out, I want to direct the members' attention to this. This is the maternal health amendment that it was revised to include serious impairment of major bodily function. It's very narrowly drawn. We're asking for reconsideration because several members have said that they wanted to vote yes and didn't get a chance to. So please pay attention to your vote. We would ask for an affirmative vote from the members on this amendment. I would beg you to consider the women of Pennsylvania and vote for this amendment. Thank you.
On the amendment from Delaware County, Representative Friend.
Once again, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to defeat this amendment as it was previously done. We feel that the standard that we have is an outstanding balance between the equities of the unborn baby and the mother. This would tremendously weaken it. The terms are indefinable. What we're getting back to is a broad-based health exception. I sincerely hope that we once again defeat the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question is whether the House will agree to the amendment. On that question, yeas and nays will now be taken. Members will proceed to vote. Have all members present voted? Have all the members present voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the question of agreeing to the amendment, the yeas are 93, the nays 107. The amendment has been defeated. Question is, will the House agree to the bill as amended? Agreed to. This bill has been considered on 3 different days and agreed to. Question is, shall the bill pass finally? Agreeable to the provisions of Constitution. Representative Josephs from Philadelphia on final passage.
Mr. Speaker, I request my 4 minutes, which I think I will not use in continuous. The first thing I would like to do is propose a motion that since we have forced the women of Pennsylvania to wait for 24 hours before they can get their procedure, that we wait for 24 hours until we vote on this bill. Only kidding, only kidding. That was a joke. But I think it points out what disrespect we have for the women here. We don't think that they can make up their minds, but we think we can make up ours, and I think that's pretty disrespectful. I've listened.
Will the House please be in order? Is the lady making a motion or not making a motion?
No, I am not.
The lady is not making a motion. She may continue with her debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, my friends, my colleagues, I have listened to this debate truly with sadness and with anger. I worked in this movement, as I said, for more than 15 years, and I should be used to the rhetoric of those people who would recriminalize abortion and make the women of Pennsylvania criminals. But I'm still astounded by the disregard and the disrespect that the proponents of this legislation treat their female colleagues, their constituents, and the women and their families who are rash enough to love them. In this legislation, there is no quarter for a woman who will be hurt, sickened, or die. Even now as we speak, there is a woman, perhaps more than one, who is attempting to self-abort. And maybe that woman is your constituent. The message that we are sending out here tonight is confusing. When we first started to debate this bill in committee, there were 2 cases of self-abortion, and I fear there will be more. If you think that the description of the abortion procedure was stomach-wrenching that we were treated to here tonight, you should hear a description of a self-abortion, and you should see a picture of a woman who is lying dead in her own blood. Right now, somewhere, a woman is risking her life, and the proponents of this legislation are responsible for what happens to her. It has been said that this issue for us is one of personal philosophy. I do not agree. What we do here is a matter of public policy. Because of their scruples, those folks, those people who would make all abortion illegal if they could, have made themselves responsible for more late procedures than we should have forced women to have early procedures when they might not have any at all, and have voted to make the pill, the IUD, and other commonly used contraceptives illegal. Make no mistake about it. The defeat of Mr. Snyder's amendment made the pill and the IUD illegal as soon as Roe v. Wade is overturned, and your constituents will know it.
Lady has used all of her time. Question is on the amendment.
Did I use 4 minutes?
You have used 4 minutes.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, and thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I haven't spoken all night. Maybe I want to give her my 4 minutes.
Unfortunately, you can't do that. On whether or not the House will agree to the amendment from Berks County, the chair recognizes Representative Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have come full circle on this issue over the past several years with this debate. We have gone from the fabricated secret secretion that prevented rape victims from becoming pregnant to the restrictive provisions of this amendment. These provisions would place a poor pregnant 18-year-old woman in dire jeopardy. She would be subject to a possible prosecution if she failed to inform a husband who may not care at all about her pregnancy. There is no responsibility placed upon the father in any portion of this legislation. This amendment is filled with the invasions of rights women maintain under current court ruling in the Constitution. In the case of incest not revealed before 24 weeks, a minor female could not qualify for abortion if she failed to reveal the same in that 24-week period. This again is another example of the major flaws in this legislation. It is as flawed as the sponsor's vehement claim to the label of sanctity of life. This legislation will not save women's lives in this Commonwealth, and I oppose the amendment.
July of this year, the Supreme Court's Webster decision let states restrict a woman's right to abortion. Instead of resolving the issue, they sent it back to the states to handle. Women accustomed to the right to choose an abortion are ended. And they indicated very strongly, when you talk about indignant, they said that since Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court of 1963 court abortion rights decision, pro-choice forces have had nothing much to fight against. Since Webster, pro-choice strategists have found that most voters have far more uneasiness about abortion than the immediate after the ruling polls indicated. Most favor the right to choose, but some with restrictions. The Catholic organization recognized that fetal life has value. It has positions on when a fetus becomes a baby and when it has a soul. They dwell over questions of morality and ethics, not about constitutional rights. In 1987, Representative Friend proposed to replace the state's 1982 Abortion Control Act because many of the major provisions were struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. This bill, like the 1982 Act, was a collection of reporting, funding, and medical procedure provision designed to discourage abortions. Key sections of the 1982 law were rejected by a 5-4 vote. The majority opinion written by Justice A. Blackmun said that the states, and I quote, are not free under the guise of protecting maternal health or potential life to intimidate women into continuing pregnancies. Representative Friend, in his remarks to the Judiciary Committee, I'd like to extend my
Gentleman's first 2 minutes have expired. The gentleman wish to continue for another 2 minutes?
I asked that both my second 2 minutes, sir, be continued. Representative Friend, in his remarks to the Judiciary Committee, stated, each year in America we kill 1.5 million innocent unborn children. In November of 1987, the Reagan administration set in motion a set of regulations that would result in a virtual ban on all forms of objective information about abortion to any other person receiving services from a federally funded family planning clinic. The doctrinaire approach to religion and life is stifling to the general population, and in this instance to women. Unlike the pursuit of a very narrow-minded, dogmatic approach, I suggest that we heed a society in which open-mindedness is not restricted to those issues which you select. I'm sure we should and do encourage the raising of questions about every aspect of life. The quote, Sister Faye Watlington of Planned Parenthood, you can't pick and choose on reproductive choices. Women either have them or they don't. How quickly can we seem to forget the days of septic abortions, Lysol and bleach injected into the uterus. It is also extremely interesting that at the end of the Reagan era, we see that those who embrace the philosophy of anti-choice advocates begin their latest attack on this issue in order to keep George Bush more and more conservative on social issues that impact on the African American, Hispanic, Asian, and other minority communities of this Commonwealth. This may be in part due to the election of an African American woman as the president of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America 11 years ago. I'm sure this is just one more of those coincidences. If we look at the history of this debate, we can see that serious debate began in the early 1980s. This was the beginning of the Reagan-Thornburg era. That was 9 years ago. The Mexico City policy of 1984.
The gentleman's time has elapsed.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to, at some point, if there's a person who does not wish to use their 2 minutes,
The gentleman's time
I'd like to raise a point of parliamentary inquiry.
Gentleman state his point of parliamentary inquiry.
Point of parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Speaker, that if there's another speaker on the floor of this House who would like to relinquish his time so that we may finish.
The 2-minute rule does not allow, in the Speaker's opinion, for one member to yield time to another member. 2 minutes have been spoken twice by the gentleman, and he is not entitled to speak longer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Question is whether the House will agree on final passage to the bill before us. On final passage of the bill from York County, Representative Bortner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this stage of the debate, I don't think anybody's mind is going to be changed. I have some remarks I'd like to become part of the record and would ask that they be submitted and become part of the record. Thank you.
The remarks can be and will be submitted for the record, and the chair thanks the gentleman. From Allegheny County, Representative Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've listened in great concern concerning this issue that we've listened to. I've heard some of my colleagues around me, away from the microphones, getting involved in some very heated and argumentative discussions. I've watched this process not really be skirted, but to be misused, in my opinion. I've watched us limit ourselves to be able to say exactly what we want to say and what we feel at particular discretions. And let's look and see exactly what we have done. Some of the things that we've said is that a woman who is married must stand up and sign a form that she's informed her husband, but it's different for single. But yet, in a sense, to the husband, we have not put the same restrictions. We sat down and required people who would want to be able to offer their constitutional right to be able to express, and I think that that is one of the greatest things that we can do to the masses, to be able to offer them a chance to be able to vote something up or down once we have put it together as far as legislation. We've denied their right. We've taken children, babies that will be born from possibly addicted to a narcotic drug form, AIDS, and potentially other diseases. We have refused outwardly by a recorded vote to give them the adequate care, and that's a lot of what this has to deal with, is the appropriate health care. Some of the different things that we've sat down to, if I may continue on with my 2 additional minutes, Mr. Speaker, that you've granted me. So we've denied an awful lot of people, and basically a lot of this deals with the socioeconomic posture of what we are doing here as a legislature. We are denying those, again, that have not, to be able to be granted a right to have adequate and proper health care, a right to be able to grow up, to receive the proper instructions and information, not just the babies, but the adults, whether they be teenagers or grown adults, to be able to have the proper health care. All we're caring about, in my opinion, is saying that you cannot do something, but denying the right and performing the proper benefit and the money behind it to provide for the end result. Those of you in rural districts, remember this in 4 or 5 years from now, when you come to this House and you're going to be asking for money for these clinics, asking for money for the health care that is not going in your districts now. And remember that you created this from your statement. So basically all we're doing is denying a group of people a right to be able to express themselves and be able to put the money where our mouths are. We haven't done that. That's too bad. I would still ask for a negative vote on House Bill 369.
The question is whether the House will agree to the bill on final passage. Representative Ritter from Lehigh County on final passage.
Mr. Speaker, this is a very sad day for this House and the women of Pennsylvania. This bill is cruel and mean-spirited. We have told the women of Pennsylvania today that they must continue to carry a fetus that will die at birth for weeks or even months. We have told the women of Pennsylvania that they must risk stroke, toxemia, and many other very serious medical conditions without the option of an early delivery to save major bodily function. We have told women who are suicidal that they should go ahead and kill themselves. We have told physicians that women have less value than a fetus, even when that fetus is not viable. We have rejected language upheld by the Supreme Court in the Webster decision. We have told the people of this state that they are not capable of deciding this issue as a referendum, that this bill is too complicated for them to understand. In fact, one speaker even suggested that some members of this House aren't capable of understanding this bill. We are acting on a bill that has been in this chamber less than 3 weeks because members want to get this issue behind us. This vote tonight will not put this issue behind us. Polls and public opinion suggest that the tide is turning on this issue out there in the real world, and most of my colleagues are about to miss the boat. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question is on final passage, and on that question from Philadelphia, Representative Harper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to oppose Senate Bill 369. I know that we do have some weak women, we have some strong women, we have some weak men, and we have some strong men. But the strong must bear the infirmness of the weak. And I shall continue to stand up for the weak and for those that cannot help themselves. Wealthy women have always paid for their abortions. Poor women have had to abort themselves and do the best that they can. But I shall continue to fight for those poor women. I have been very fortunate. I've always had a job. I've always had enough money to buy the things that I really wanted and needed. Some women don't have that privilege, but I shall continue to fight for them and oppose this type of legislation. Thank you.
On final passage, Chair recognizes from Center County, Representative Rudy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, due to the lateness of the hour, I'd like to submit my remarks for the record. Thank you.
Ladies, in order, the remarks will be sent to the clerk for submission to the record. From Montgomery County, Representative Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From an objective viewpoint, one has to wonder why the Pennsylvania House today has been engaged in another round of legislative efforts on the issue of abortions. Current law already prohibits abortions after viability, except in those instances where an abortion is necessary to preserve the life or health of the mother. The basic thrust of this new legislation sets 24 weeks rather than viability as the time. In the past year, one abortion was performed later than 26 weeks. 93.5% of all abortions took place in the first trimester. Passage of this new legislation will not reduce the number of abortions performed in Pennsylvania over the next year. Its provisions will cause further difficulty for women. It will add greater cost. It will cause delay. But it does not and cannot deny a woman an abortion because that remains a constitutional right for women. Spousal notification sets a very frightening precedent in our Commonwealth. As if we haven't already interfered too much in people's private lives, now we are going to establish parameters within which a marriage is to function. Further, Representative Friend indicates that court challenges to this provision to notify a spouse have been upheld as constitutional. Somehow only spouses must be so notified, but no such provision is made regarding non-spousal fathers. The Constitution makes no such distinction. Requirements to determine gestational age is of no concern to the Commonwealth until after viability. Yet attempts to remove these kinds of harassment were denied as amendments were offered and other specific provisions for which there has been no indication of a need
have been denied as those amendments were offered. The Supreme Court has indicated in its recent decision that abortions can be controlled on a rational basis, yet rational arguments to make changes in areas, I'd like the second too. Rational arguments to make changes in an area which will most certainly be challenged in court were voted down as in past votes on this issue. The last round of court cases on anti-abortion legislation has cost the Commonwealth a great deal of money. I've fought for more money for handicapped children, for retarded citizens of all ages, for education in general as well as special education. That amount of money spent in court could have served some of these purposes. What we really should be about is the prevention of teenage pregnancy and other unwanted pregnancies. We must deal with latchkey children. Most teenage pregnancies occurred between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. We must emphasize television literacy and campaign to offset the negative influence of bed hopping featured in these soap operas. Our churches and synagogues must renew their efforts in assisting our young people in making important decisions about their lifestyle. The proliferation of abortions is a symptom of moral decay shared with drugs and alcohol abuse. This new legislation will not change that situation one bit. It could compound it in that concerned people might feel that with its passage the fight is over. It is unfortunate that both sides of this issue have not joined hands to deal with the real issue, that of unwanted pregnancy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sure, thanks, gentlemen. On the question of whether or not the bill should pass, finally, from Philadelphia, Representative Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe this is a bright and happy day for Pennsylvania because I believe we are taking one step further in placing a higher value on all human life, and I'm proud to be a part of this moment. I just want to pledge to those that think that we who are on the side of life on this issue, as a minority member of this House, as I have in the past, I will certainly work very hard for all the needy concerns of all Pennsylvanians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
From Philadelphia County, the chair recognizes Representative Hughes.
Mr. Speaker, I want to urge a negative vote on final passage. This, Mr. Speaker, is a dark and dismal day for the state of Pennsylvania. A dark and dismal day for all of us, for the women, the children, the men, and everyone who lives in this state of Pennsylvania. Mr. Speaker, we are setting here today potentially precedent for the entire nation. Pennsylvania representatives will rue the day that this occurred. We have asked women today, Mr. Speaker, to carry dead babies to term and not giving them an opportunity to seek relief. We've asked, Mr. Speaker, to provide support for life, Mr. Speaker, for women when they gave birth, and that has been denied them. We've asked, Mr. Speaker, and we have allowed, Mr. Speaker, the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and the lawmakers of this Commonwealth to enter into the inner sanctum of the personal relationships and the private relationships of spouses. We have asked, Mr. Speaker, for poor women to continue their status in this Commonwealth as second-class citizens. We have done all this, Mr. Speaker, in a state, in a Commonwealth, where reproductive health services are basically non-existent. We will rue the day that we took this action, Mr. Speaker. We have made a major error in judgment with women of all classes in this Commonwealth, and we will rue this day. I ask for a negative vote, Mr. Speaker, on final passage.
Chair recognizes from Philadelphia for the first time today, Representative Acosta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the previous speakers, Mr. Richardson, I could never understand his statement when he began to speak. So I would like to ask him, I would like to interrogate him if I could.
Gentleman, Mr. Richardson certainly will consent to interrogation. Gentleman is in order to proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I would like you to continue your statement.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to respond to the gentleman's question concerning the Mexico City's policy of 1984 lawsuit by
The chair was unable to hear the question put to Mr. Richardson by Mr. Acosta. The purpose of interrogation is to elicit information, to ask questions of speakers. I was unable to discern the question in the gentleman's statement.
Mr. Speaker, in order for me to ask questions, I'd like to have him finish the statement that he was making.
I don't know how long I should continue this battle, but I still didn't hear the question. Mr. Richardson, did you hear the question?
Yes, sir, Mr. Speaker, I
Then
did.
you better answer it.
Mr. Speaker Richardson, I'd like to hear your concerns about the poor women of the state of Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I'll try to answer the best of my ability. Under the Mexico...
You only have 2 minutes, or what's left of the 2 minutes.
Under the Mexico City policy of 1984, lawsuit by Planned Parenthood was dismissed in 1987. This policy was designed to cut off the Agency for International Family Planning ability to offer abortions and referrals or counselings about abortion, even if those programs are undetermined by private funds. At or about the same time, the Reagan administration announced a policy which is comparable on the domestic front. Federal regulation were promulgated to have clinics and agencies lose federal family planning grants through Title X of Public Health Services Act, provided abortions, abortion counseling, and referrals, or simply advised women on the availability of abortions. May I have 2 minutes to continue, Mr. Speaker?
No, it's not your floor time. Would you like to submit your remarks for the record?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to submit the
I will
remarks.
give you the opportunity to do that in summation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlemen
Mr.
may
Speaker.
submit the balance of the remarks for the record.
Mr. Speaker, I'm still confused about his message.
Mr. Acosta, you have not been given the privilege of the floor at this time.
I'm sorry, Mr.
Chair
Speaker.
recognizes this time Representative Friend from Delaware County. Gentlemen seek recognition. From Philadelphia County, Representative Thomas.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to Senate Bill 369. And if the vote on Senate Bill 369 goes as the myriad of amendments have went this evening, then I only ask my colleagues that we be prepared to deal with 3 things upon returning to the House. 1, we must prepare for the avalanche of litigation and hostility that we have unleashed in the communities of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Passage of Senate Bill 369 will definitely result in growing hostility as to the role of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. And I remind my colleagues about what happened in the state of Florida once Webster was decided. No one could predict the degree of hostility that was unleashed in poor women and women across the state of Florida. And if an election could have been held when that General Assembly was reconvened to deal with this question, I think that we all would see a different situation in Florida right now. Secondly, we have went forward tonight through amendments and probably through Senate Bill 369 restricted a woman's right to make her own decision as it relates to her body. We have restricted that. We have went so far as to say that it is the role of the Pennsylvania General Assembly to decide when and under what circumstances the whole doctrine of spousal notice should be given and who it should be given to. And I think that we have went far beyond the intent of this General Assembly, and we are going to reap the whirlwind of that in the courts. So I hope that we be prepared to deal with that. And lastly, there were a number of amendments
Since 2 minutes has expired.
May I have one more minute?
You're entitled to an additional 2 minutes if you wish to take them at this time.
Yes, I'd like to take those 2 minutes.
You are in order.
Lastly, we have seen a number of amendments this evening asking that the General Assembly consider the unwanted children that exist across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania who we have neither provided shelter nor provided basic services for. We have also seen a number of amendments to deal with women who are trapped in a situation from chemical dependency and from other illnesses that they have no way out. Somebody has to bear that burden, and in response to those amendments tonight, we rejected those amendments. So upon return, we are going to have to take the necessary steps to ensure that no Pennsylvanian has to suffer at the level that thousands of Pennsylvanians are suffering in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania right now. We cannot continue to overlook that. It's our responsibility. We have both a moral and financial obligation to deal with those people throughout the Commonwealth. So I only ask that upon return, after we have freshened up and have our focuses clear, that we entertain those 3 questions because we will have to deal with it. Thank you. And I urge opposition to Senate Bill 369.
From Allegheny County, Representative Gamble on final passage.
I rise to support the Friend Amendment and to congratulate Representative Friend on an excellent job as floor leader on the pro-life amendment. The winds of change are blowing across this country, and I am proud to be a part of this General Assembly of Pennsylvania to be the first state to bring about that change. Tonight we have at least curtailed the notion that anything and everything does not go in Pennsylvania. And tonight, when we vote on this pro-life amendment, we will strike a blow for what is good, what is decent, and what is right, and what is pro-family when we pass the pro-life amendment. Thank you.
From Philadelphia County, Representative Linton on final passage of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad I'm not in a boat with Representative Gamble because it's clear that he doesn't know which way the wind is blowing. I have joined here today with many of my colleagues in trying to support reproductive rights for the women in Pennsylvania. However, it's apparent that the majority of my colleagues are not interested in voting the interests of their constituency, but are intent on voting their personal choice on this matter, a choice you have denied the women of Pennsylvania. But I'd like to know, Mr. Speaker, where are these, as they call themselves, so-called pro-life individuals when the women in this Commonwealth seek to provide financial assistance for their children? We saw that this evening by the vote on the amendment that I offered, that they chose not to provide the financial support for those children so that they can live a productive life in the society. Where were those so-called pro-life, which I choose to say anti-choice individuals, when we attempted tonight to try to make sure that there were adequate care for crack-addicted babies, when we tried to make sure that those babies were afflicted with AIDS got adequate care? Where were those who say they want to support life? Well, they stood up and said this is a happy hour in Pennsylvania. They said to the women of this Commonwealth, don't worry, be happy. Don't worry if you have to provide for a child without resources, be happy. Don't worry if you're not going to be able to find a home for your crack-addicted granddaughter, grandmother, be happy. This callous legislative body have said to women in this Commonwealth, don't worry, be happy. And unfortunately, we are going to have to live with our actions here today. May I ask, Mr. Speaker, for my final 2 minutes?
Gentleman is in order.
We will be forced to deal with the truth behind the decision we made today. by more coat hanger, cocaine abortions, throwaway and beaten children, juvenile delinquents, and children who grow up into bitter, disenfranchised adults who will turn their backs on a system run by men who care only about their own wants and needs, and only those people when it serves them politically. These are the chickens, my friends, which are coming home to roost and will soon become the downfall of Pennsylvania and of America. These are the young folks in these neighborhoods who are selling drugs. These are the young folks in these neighborhoods who are being abused. These are the young folks that you're concerned about dealing with every day of this house, but you're saying to those mothers, you must have them no matter what your financial ability is. I think you should have to live with this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask for a negative vote on Senate Bill 369.
Sure, thanks, gentlemen. Rule 15 of the House of Representatives requires that the House adjourn at 11 p.m. We are several minutes away from that. Without objection, the chair will suspend for a very short period of time beyond 11 o'clock so that we may complete the work on this bill. The chair hears no objection. Representative Heckler on final passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This legislation was introduced less than 1 month ago. It was not available for amendments in the substantive committee in which it was considered. Today, we have amended it into a Senate bill so that it will be unavailable for the normal deliberative processes of that body. Many across the United States have suggested that it is the state legislatures of our nation and not our courts where matters concerning these vital and fundamentally personal matters should be decided. I would suggest that this process should raise profound questions about that belief. Because of the process by which we have reached this moment and because of the contents of this legislation, I urge the defeat of Senate Bill 369.
Question is on final passage of the bill. On that question, yeas and nays will now be taken. Members will proceed to vote.
Mr. Speaker, can I have the last?
Nothing is in order but the taking of the vote. On final passage of the bill, have all members voted? Clerk will record the vote. On final passage of the bill, the yeas are 143, the nays 58. The bill passes finally, and the clerk will present the same to the Senate for concurrence. For the information of members of the House,